Hey guys, tonight we're diving into something strange and sleepy. You're standing in the corner of a medieval herb garden, crushed thyme underfoot, the scent rising like incense. The nuns are chanting somewhere in the distance, their voices blending with birdsong and the occasional cough of a sickly sheep. It feels peaceful, monastic, holy maybe. But as you pass the crumbling wall near the old kitchen, you hear something that absolutely should not be coming from a convent. The low, rhythmic moans of a woman in labor. Welcome to another round of boring history for sleep, where nothing is ever quite what it seems. If you're new here, this is your collection of strange, slow-paced stories to fall asleep to. And tonight's tale, about why most medieval nuns were pregnant, is weirder than it has any right to be. Quick pause. If you enjoy these sleepy stories, a like and sub go a long way, but only if you really mean it. And if you're still awake enough, drop your location and what time it is where you are. It's always fun knowing who else is dozing off to the same boring history for sleep nonsense. Anyway, back to the nuns. See, you might imagine a medieval nun as this serene, floating figure, swathed in linen, praying at all hours and repelling temptation like its fleas. But in reality, things got complicated fast. The church liked to imagine convents as sealed boxes where sin couldn't reach, except sin has legs and a horse, and often the keys to the front gate. You're watching the scene now. A small stone hut just off the cloister, usually used for drying herbs, has been transformed into an improvised birthing room. There's a bucket of hot water. A sweating woman in a habit is clutching a wooden beam, her face twisted in pain. The older nun beside her mutters a mix of Latin and what sounds suspiciously like a curse. You know, in case heaven needs a little backup. So how did we get here? Well, it turns out that getting pregnant as a nun was not a once-in-a-blue-moon scandal. It was weirdly frequent. Some historians even argue that most nunneries in Europe had at least 1 or 2 pregnancies per generation, often more. Not just accidental hidden ones either. In some cases, the whole convent quietly adapted to it, a problem that reappeared often enough to become routine. The reasons weren't always the same. Some girls were sent to convents too young to consent, others to hide pregnancies that already existed. Sometimes it was abuse, other times it was love. Messy, forbidden, inconvenient love. But whatever the reason, the outcome was often the same. A nun with child, a baby who couldn't stay, and a whole community that pretended it never happened. And here's the first strange fact for tonight's sleep story. Pregnant nuns weren't necessarily kicked out. You'd think they would be. But punishment was inconsistent. Some were exiled, yes, but others stayed, raised the child inside the walls, or handed it off to a nearby midwife who didn't ask questions. In at least one case, the child of a nun went on to become the convent's own priest. Let that sink in slowly. There's one particular case from 14th century England where a nun went into labor during Vespers. As the rest of the sisters sang psalms, she slipped out a side door and gave birth in the laundry room. The baby was named Benedict, allegedly because he came during the Benedictus. How's that for thematic timing? Now don't get the wrong idea. These weren't orgies behind the altar. Most nuns lived difficult, rule-heavy lives. Their days were structured to the minute, and temptation wasn't exactly encouraged. But no structure is perfect. And when you lock away dozens of young women, many of them placed there against their will, strange things start to grow between the cracks. Especially when you factor in the male staff. Let's talk about the gardener. Every convent had one, sometimes several, young, local, poor and grateful for the work. He didn't sleep on the grounds, but he was there at dawn. And if he had a limp or a lopsided smile, no one noticed once the herbs started blooming. He didn't speak Latin, but he knew how to smile at a girl who did. There are records of nuns bribing their way to meet lovers at the garden gate. Some climbed the outer wall, others simply asked forgiveness later, because if you confessed, truly confessed, God would forgive, And maybe that's what made it easier. You weren't damning your soul, you were taking a detour. One of the more bizarre details tonight comes from a 13th century Flemish convent that banned mirrors because too many nuns were admiring their figures and tempting the devil. So they replaced the mirrors with crucifixes, which, to be fair, is one way to kill a vibe. Now here's where the mystery creeps in. Historians argue over the why. Why didn't the church crack down harder? Why weren't pregnant nuns simply expelled across the board? One theory is that convents were expensive. If a girl came with a dowry, and many did, it was better to keep her and hush the incident than lose both her and her money. Others think it was more emotional than financial, that once a sister was part of the community, she was family. You don't just throw family out. And maybe, deep down, they all knew something we forget. Vows don't cancel biology. You can kneel and pray and chant for 8 hours a day, but your body still lives in the same world as the baker's daughter and the goose girl by the stream. Flesh doesn't care about your robe. Some nuns were even midwives themselves, skilled, discreet, and painfully aware of how to hide signs of pregnancy with tight bindings and strategic fasting. You watch one now, adjusting her patient's habit, wiping sweat from her brow, whispering a prayer that sounds more maternal than holy. There's no doctor coming, no official record being kept, just a sister helping another sister in the quiet way women have always done. And as the baby cries out, muffled quickly by cloth, you feel something shift. A blend of guilt and defiance, sorrow and strange relief. Because even in a place built on silence and self-denial, life still finds its way in. Even here. Especially here. You follow the sound of soft humming through the corridor. It's late now. The oil lamps have burned low, casting amber pools of light on the worn stone floor. You pass a small wooden door, cracked open just enough to glimpse a figure inside. She's cradling something. It isn't a prayer book. The infant is swaddled in linen strips, no bigger than a loaf of bread. His tiny fists punch the air with sleepy confusion, as if he's already questioning the absurdity of his birthplace. The nun holding him isn't crying. She's not smiling either, just still. As if caught in the quiet eye of a storm. This is the part where things get awkward. Because sometimes the pregnancy wasn't a secret. Sometimes it was a story, one designed to explain the inexplicable, or at least redirect the shame somewhere higher up the divine food chain. And here's where we meet the nun who had twins. Her name was Hildegard, though that wasn't her birth name. Most girls were renamed when they took the veil, as if swapping identities could help erase whatever past they were fleeing, or whatever future they didn't choose. Hildegard entered the convent at 16. She had strong cheekbones, a habit of walking barefoot in the chapel, and a tendency to question the priest a little too much during scripture lessons. When she got pregnant, yes, pregnant with twins, she didn't deny it. She didn't even flinch. She claimed very calmly that the children had been placed in her womb by angels, sent by God to test the convent's faith. Her tone was so eerily serene that even the abbess, who had survived both famine and plague, didn't know what to say. It wasn't the first time a nun claimed divine pregnancy, but it was the first time anyone had said it like they fully believed it. Now, before you scoff yourself awake, keep in mind that medieval Europe was practically allergic to scientific explanation. Miracles were currency. Relics wept, statues blinked, and bread occasionally bled if it helped prove a point. So when a nun in Italy in the 12th century claimed she bore the child of Christ, the church investigated, then quietly swept it under the rug. Because what do you even do with that? Burn her? Praise her? Promote her? They did none of those. They just made sure she never spoke to visitors again. In Hildegard's case, things were less dramatic. The twins didn't survive long. They were born early, small, and sickly. One lived a week. The other died the night after their baptism. No one told the bishop. The midwife buried them behind the tool shed, next to a patch of foxglove and dying cabbages, and life carried on. That's the strangest part, isn't it? That these moments, these ruptures in the supposedly divine order of convent life, didn't shatter anything. No thunderbolts, no hellfire, just a few days of whispered prayers and longer silences, and then back to baking bread and copying scripture. You might be wondering, did the other nuns believe her? Did they really buy the whole angel twins routine? Maybe, maybe not. But belief in medieval nunneries wasn't binary, it wasn't true or false, it was useful or dangerous. If Hildegard's story kept her safe, if it kept the convent from scandal, and if she still scrubbed floors and sang at Lord's, then what did it matter? Besides, miracles were popular, especially the weird ones. One nun supposedly lactated wine during a vision, another bled from her hands and claimed it was a gift from the Virgin. These weren't isolated claims. They were part of the culture, part of the marketing even. If your convent had a miracle, you got pilgrims. Pilgrims brought donations, and donations kept the walls from crumbling and the rats out of the flour. So when a nun gave birth and said it was a holy pregnancy, people didn't always laugh. Some whispered, others crossed themselves and looked the other way. But not everyone played the miracle card. Many pregnancies were wrapped in shame, silence, and hurried decisions. Babies left at church doors. Nuns who simply left the convent and never came back. A mysterious illness that took a sister's life, with no one daring to call it childbirth, even if everyone knew. And here's a fringe detail for your bedtime stories to fall asleep for adults stash. In one German convent, they kept a locked box labeled for unclean cloths. Inside were rags used during labor, not menstruation, labor. And the key was held by a woman who wasn't a nun at all, just a silent old midwife who lived in the stables. She never attended services, never spoke unless spoken to. But when a girl started vomiting after morning prayers, she was the one summoned. It's hard to say how many of these pregnancies came from consensual relationships, probably fewer than we'd hope. Clerical abuse was rampant, and not just from strangers. Confessors, priests, even bishops. Some took advantage of their spiritual authority. Others simply took advantage. But there were also stories, quiet, broken things of love, of two people meeting in the one place they shouldn't. A stable boy who brought feed for the chickens, a scholar sent to repair books, a traveling musician. These moments bloomed quickly, died just as fast, and left behind evidence that cried and needed to be fed every 3 hours. The church, for its part, had no consistent policy. Sometimes the nun was sent away. Sometimes the priest was moved to another parish. Once in a while, the child was raised inside the convent, disguised as an orphan or an adopted foundling. The idea that he might be the product of a holy union. Easier to swallow than the idea that Sister Agnes had a boyfriend. And as you drift through the stone hallways, hearing those whispers bounce off the vaulted ceiling, you realize something else. These weren't just spiritual women caught in scandal. They were real people, trying to reconcile a life of rigid rules with a body that didn't care, a body that wanted warmth, touch, comfort, or simply didn't have a say in the matter. So when Hildegard stared down the abbess and said, "The angels chose me," maybe she wasn't lying. Maybe that was the only version of the story she could survive. You pass the refectory now, where silence once ruled like a tyrant. But behind the stillness, you can almost hear the echoes of questions too dangerous to speak aloud. Not just who the father might be, but why this keeps happening. Why does the rule of chastity fail, again and again, even behind cloistered walls, thick enough to keep out armies? It's tempting to chalk it all up to human weakness. A broken vow here, a forbidden tryst there. But that answer's too clean, and this story has far messier corners. Let's linger with one of them. A novice named Margeta, 17, sent to a monastery in rural Croatia because her dowry wasn't large enough for marriage. but just enough to buy her a spot in a crumbling convent near the Drava River. The nuns spoke 3 languages badly. The chapel bell was cracked, and the local priest, Father Luca, visited often, too often. At first, Marjeta believed everything they told her, that obedience was sacred, that silence pleased God, that sin came from within. She fasted until her lips cracked, woke at dawn to pray until her knees bruised. She flinched every time a male voice echoed down the corridor. But Father Luca had a warm laugh and brought honeyed bread when the stores ran low. And when he stayed too long after confession, no one seemed to notice. Or they noticed, but noticing was dangerous. You watch as Marjeta starts to show. She wraps her waist tighter, walks hunched, fakes illness to skip meals. But a body can't be tricked forever. One day she faints during psalms, and suddenly the secret isn't a secret anymore. The abbess says nothing for 3 days. On the 4th, she calls Marjeta to her chambers. She doesn't yell, she doesn't cry. She simply pours tea and says, "We will find a way." Not what happened or how dare you, just that. A decision made quietly, like sewing a tear in a curtain. And here's the brutal historical fact for this section. The church had very little interest in investigating these kinds of pregnancies. It wasn't that they didn't care. It was that they didn't want the hassle. If you opened one scandal, 3 more might crawl out. Better to keep things local, silent, controlled. This led to strange, bureaucratic solutions. In one French convent, girls were labeled unclean and sent to a nearby house of penance, which was basically a spiritual holding cell where they could repent in isolation, supervised by older women who had also sinned and now specialized in watching others not sin. In England, the Bishop of Winchester once ordered an entire nunnery's leadership replaced after 3 pregnancies occurred in a single year. The new abbess was instructed to tighten the discipline, which is a polite way of saying install locks. But even under the tightest discipline, the vows couldn't erase biology. The rules were spiritual, but the consequences were physical. Let's talk about those vows for a moment. When a girl became a nun, she took 3: poverty, chastity, obedience. They were supposed to strip her down to the soul. No possessions, no lovers, no free will, just submission. But the bodies taking those vows didn't magically transform into sexless angels. They bled, they ached, they dreamed strange dreams after eating too much cheese. And sometimes they got pregnant. It's easy now, centuries later, to flatten these women into metaphors, victims, rebels, symbols of institutional failure, but they were also people in absurd situations, like Marjeta, who wasn't kicked out, wasn't even punished. The abbess simply sent her to work in the kitchen and instructed the other nuns not to speak of her condition. When the child came, a girl, it was passed off to a local farmer's wife. No one ever visited, no one ever mentioned her again. Marjeta finished her novitiate the following spring. She lived to be 79. The mystery here isn't how she survived. It's how common her story was. There are dozens like it, buried in court records and monastery notes, scribbled in the margins of dusty books. And what they show is a strange kind of tolerance, not kindness, not justice, but a tacit, exhausted acceptance. The church thundered from the pulpit, but inside the cloister, real life had its own weather. You find another example tucked inside a forgotten ledger from a Bohemian abbey. It lists supplies distributed to the infirmary. Bread, wine, swaddling cloths. Swaddling cloths? Infirmary? The entry is crossed out but still legible. A sleep story in miniature, one that never made it into the sermons. And now for your bizarre historical detail of the night. Some nunneries grew their own contraceptive herbs, silphium, pennyroyal, and rue. Officially, they were grown for medicinal purposes. But we know what those purposes were. A tea that quieted the womb, a poultice to bring on bleeding. One abbess even kept a book of herbal remedies that included a recipe titled "For Unwanted Seed." The contradiction is dizzying. Publicly they preached abstinence, privately they planted preventative gardens. So where does that leave you? Maybe staring into the smoke-blackened rafters of a convent kitchen, wondering how many prayers were whispered over cups of bitter tea. How many girls like Margetta chanted hymns with secrets kicking under their ribs. How many abbesses stitched blankets for children they would never name. There is no clean line here, no satisfying ending. Just layers of obedience and rebellion, stacked like the stones of the monastery itself. And maybe that's the point. The story isn't about nuns breaking vows. It's about what happens when rules built by men try to contain the wildness of being human. A wildness that slips in through the garden gate and leaves its mark. You move into the scriptorium now, the quietest room of all. Even the dust hangs in stillness. The air smells of ink and dried glue, and somewhere in the corner, a candle flickers its last breath. This is where the sisters copy prayers and psalms, day after day, in rows so neat they'd make a modern calligrapher weep. But even here, in the most disciplined corner of the convent, you find the same faint tension humming beneath the surface. Because at the end of the day, nunneries weren't just religious institutions, they were social experiments. And you've probably guessed by now, most of those experiments were wildly underfunded. Imagine it. You take 24 girls, some rich, some poor, most of them barely old enough to bleed, and you wall them up together in a crumbling stone compound, tell them never to speak unless spoken to, and expect them to find enlightenment by sewing altar cloths for the next 50 years. You sprinkle in fasting, sleep deprivation, and a vague threat of hellfire, and you act surprised when someone ends up pregnant. This wasn't Hogwarts. There were no floating candles, no grand banquets. Most nunneries barely scraped by. Some had rats in the dormitories. Others had to make their own shoes out of goat hide and stubborn optimism. And when you get enough bored, tired people together in a high-stress environment with no privacy, well, things happen. But don't picture chaos. Picture discipline cracking in very quiet ways. One sister sneaks a glance during prayer. Another lingers too long in the garden shed. A novice touches a forbidden hand and doesn't pull away. It all happens beneath layers of habit and holy routine, like moss growing under floorboards. You see, medieval convents were rarely the serene spiritual havens the church liked to advertise. They were more like pressure cookers. Not because nuns were wild heathens trying to escape their vows, but because they were human beings in a system that didn't allow for being human. And here's the historical fact of this section. A surprising number of nuns didn't actually choose to be nuns. Many were placed there by families who couldn't afford marriage dowries. Some were the illegitimate daughters of nobles, parked in cloisters to avoid scandal. Others were simply born at the wrong time, in the wrong gender, with too many siblings ahead of them in the inheritance line. They took vows because they had no choice. Some were as young as 7, and that makes a difference. Because you're not watching a room full of women who gave up the world to chase the divine. You're watching a room full of girls trying to make sense of a life someone else chose for them. Some adapted, some thrived, some didn't. One of the strangest stories comes from a convent in Castile, where the sisters reportedly used dolls to practice mothering, not for training, for comfort. These weren't toys. They were wrapped in cloth, rocked, sometimes even named. A few slept with them clutched close at night, whispering lullabies between psalms. Was it innocent, symbolic, or something else entirely? No one really knows. But here's the fringe detail you'll want to tuck into your memory. One convent in Poland carved small wooden confession figures with rounded bellies. They claimed they were statues of Saint Anne, but local rumors called them nun dolls, Women who gave birth in silence, whose stories were buried in wood grain and hidden on shelves. It's both eerie and heartbreaking. You reach the end of the scriptorium and step into a tiny room that smells of lavender and vinegar, a cell, the kind assigned to older sisters who could no longer kneel for long hours. There's a cracked window, a single bed, and a worn comb resting on the sill. You notice the faint marks scratched into the wall, not tally marks, names, 3 of them, all male, each carved with trembling hands. Maybe sons, maybe not. One of the most fascinating theories among historians is that some nunneries, especially those in more remote areas, gradually became semi-independent micro-societies. Places where church rules were followed just enough to keep attention away, but not so strictly as to crush the women inside. In these spaces, a pregnancy wasn't just a scandal. It was a test, a decision point, and many abbesses, especially the older, world-worn ones, chose discretion over punishment. They weren't being rebellious. They were being practical. If a novice gave birth, the convent had choices. Send her away and risk gossip, or keep her, raise the child quietly, and carry on. Often the second path was less dangerous, less noisy. And remember those garden boys and kitchen hands. Many of them were the sons of nuns, raised within the walls, given jobs as groundskeepers, cooks, bell ringers, never told the full truth, sometimes never told anything at all. That's the unspoken irony here. The vow of chastity didn't stop children from being born. It just made sure no one talked about it. Now let's circle back to that experiment idea. When you treat a convent like a place to hide inconvenient women, from scandal, from temptation, from financial burden, eventually the convent stops being a sanctuary and starts being a storage closet. And even closets have leaks. The church wrote rules, the nuns wrote prayers. But life wrote itself into the margins, in labor pains and lullabies whispered after compline. And as you drift back toward the cloister, you realize you're not just hearing a story about broken vows. You're hearing a story about containment, and how every structure, no matter how rigid, eventually bends. You'll see that again in the next room. But first, take a breath. There's incense burning in the chapel. A low hum of chanting rises like smoke. And somewhere nearby, a baby is crying. You follow the sound of the crying, though no one else seems to hear it. It pulls you toward the infirmary, tucked in the oldest wing of the convent, where the walls sweat in summer and freeze in winter. The smell hits first. Cloves, beeswax, and something faintly metallic beneath it. Not blood. Not exactly. More like a memory of it. Inside, a nun is adjusting bandages on a swollen ankle, humming a hymn that went out of style a century ago. You glance to your left. There's a wooden bench, a pitcher of water, and next to it, something strange. A box of garlic cloves. You frown. Garlic isn't exactly holy. It's pungent, common, the sort of thing you expect in soup, not in a room dedicated to healing the soul and body. But here's where it gets weird. Because in the Middle Ages, garlic was used in more than just cooking. It was also a medieval pregnancy test. Well, sort of. One popular method involved placing a clove of garlic in a woman's, let's say, internal canal before bed. The next morning, if her breath smelled faintly of garlic, it was assumed her womb was open and healthy. If not, blocked, possibly pregnant, or just not very good at garlic vapor circulation. You sit with that image for a moment. This wasn't fringe science, it was mainstream medical advice. The kind passed down by midwives and scribbled into apothecary scrolls with serious faces and terrible illustrations. It wasn't the only method. In some convents, they used melted candle wax poured into water to read the shape of a woman's uterus. Others relied on more invasive techniques, checking pulse points, observing the clarity of urine or pressing gently on the abdomen to detect quickening. One particularly eccentric physician insisted that pregnancy could be detected if a woman's pupils changed shape under moonlight. He may or may not have also believed in trolls. But the most telling tests weren't physical, they were behavioral. Was she vomiting in the mornings, craving vinegar, walking slower, praying with extra fervor? One nun reportedly confessed her sin simply because she found herself staring too long at a statue of St. Joseph with longing. That was enough for the abbess to order examination by candlelight, whatever that meant. You glance back at the garlic and feel your stomach turn, just slightly, because all of this poking and testing wasn't really about discovery. It was about control. See, pregnancy in a nunnery wasn't a medical event, it was a crisis. And like any crisis, the first step was to confirm whether it was real. But confirming didn't mean accepting, it meant deciding what story to tell. Would the girl be branded a sinner or a victim, a liar or just an unfortunate? That decision usually came from the abbess. And here's the historical fact for this section. Abbesses held real power. In many convents, the abbess wasn't just a spiritual leader. She was a landlord, a judge, a strategist. She managed land, negotiated with bishops, and balanced ledgers with more skill than most noblemen. And when a girl came to her with trembling hands and a secret swelling under her ribs, the abbess weighed more than just sin. She weighed the cost. Would expulsion bring scandal? Would silence preserve peace? Some abbesses were merciful, others were brutal. One record from a convent in Vienna mentions a nun who was locked in a storage room for 6 months after giving birth, fed only bread and water. When she emerged, she never spoke again. But that was rare. More often, a quiet system emerged. Step 1, confirm the pregnancy. Step 2, restrict the girl's duties to places where she wouldn't be seen, kitchen, infirmary, garden. Step 3, when the time came, call for the midwife, not a church-appointed one, a local widow, paid in coin and secrecy. Step 4, the child vanishes. No record, no name, just a bundle taken through the back gate and left with a farmer, a baker, or in some cases, the nearby leper house. You pause at the back gate now. It's old, barely hanging on its hinges. Ivy swallows half the frame. You imagine the footsteps here, hurried and silent. A nun in a shawl, a midwife in the dark, the wind hiding the sound of a baby's cry. There's a mystery here you can't quite shake. How many of these children came back? There are whispered stories. A stable boy with eyes like Sister Clara's, a choir boy whose singing made one nun faint, a merchant who once knocked on the convent door and asked if the woman who gave me life still lived there. No one answered. And then there's the truly strange detail. Some nunneries reportedly practiced dry baptism. When a baby was born in secret and died before it could be publicly christened, the midwife would whisper the baptismal rites in the child's ear with a splash of well water. It wasn't officially recognized, but it gave the women peace, a private ceremony for a public impossibility. You linger in that image for a moment. Because for all the testing, all the rules, all the cloistered protocols, what you find over and over is this quiet thread of compassion, not perfect, not always fair, but real. A girl was afraid. The other women helped, even if they didn't agree, even if they whispered about her afterward, they still helped. And in the end, when the last candle goes out and the garlic is tucked away, what you're left with is not a mystery of science, but a mystery of survival. How these women built lives inside the walls, how they made room for mistakes, for children, for secrets wrapped in linen, how they told stories in the dark, even when no one was supposed to be listening. You wake early, if wake is even the right word for it in this dreamlike drift. The convent is quiet now, not from peace, but from the thick hush that settles after a decision's been made. Somewhere a rooster crows, but he sounds half-hearted, like even he isn't sure it's worth the effort anymore. You pass the chapel. The candles still burn there. The sisters file in like shadows, silent, focused, purposeful. But you can tell which ones are different. The girl with the drawn face, the one who winces slightly when kneeling, the elder who gives her a gentle nudge to keep singing. They all know. No one says anything. You find the abbess in her study, tracing the edge of a parchment with the tip of her thumbnail. Her desk is tidy. Her shoulders are square. On the table beside the ledger and ink pot is a folded cloth bundle. Tiny, pale blue, embroidered with a single name. Not the mother's name, not the father's, just Michaela. She sets it aside without a word. This is where decisions happen. Not in the cathedral, not in Rome. Right here, in a room that smells of old vellum and chamomile tea. And tonight's sleep story ends, fittingly, in this space between mercy and necessity. Because every pregnancy in a medieval convent was a story. Some were punished, some were hidden, some were rewritten until no one remembered the truth. But each required a choice. And most of those choices were made by women. Quietly, without fanfare, with hands still red from the laundry and knees sore from prayer. You think of Sister Magdalena. She'd taken a vow of silence for Lent. But when a novice named Julita began to show, Magdalena broke it for the first time in 40 days. Not to scold, not to condemn, but to say, "You're not the first." That's all. A single sentence. And yet it held the entire weight of centuries of hidden births, suppressed sorrow, and stitched-up shame. That's the other historical fact we don't talk about enough. The Church may have written the rules, but women enforced them, interpreted them, bent them when necessary, sometimes in cruel ways, sometimes not. One convent in Denmark had a ledger with a column labeled "Irregular Events." Most of the entries were about lost sheep, spoiled wine, or broken roof tiles. But in one winter month, the entry simply read, "The girl was sent away. The infant was taken to the forest." And that was that. No sermon, no moral, just 2 lives disappeared into the margins of the monastery's memory. You reach the cloister again. A circle of stone arches around a patch of stubborn grass, a place for walking and praying, though the sisters rarely use it. Too exposed, too easy to be seen. You imagine them here anyway. The ones who stayed, the ones who left, the ones who carried their secrets like rosary beads, worn smooth from repetition. And now one last strange little detail to keep you company as you drift off. In a convent in Florence, a small statue was found behind a false wall during a renovation. It wasn't of Mary or Jesus or any saint. It was a carved figure of a woman holding a baby. Her robe was a nun's habit, her face worn blank by time. But someone long ago had scratched a word into the base: forgive. No date, no name, just that. It's not a twist ending, no grand reveal, just the slow, bittersweet unraveling of a world where rules collided with bodies, and women did their best with what they had. You wonder, as you step back toward the dormitory, how many of those babies grew up never knowing who sang them to sleep? How many girls whispered apologies into the night? And how many of those secrets are still floating somewhere, caught in the dust above the rafters, waiting to be told, or maybe not told, maybe just heard, quietly, like this. Wind down. And now, as the convent fades behind you, its heavy doors closing with a sigh, you find yourself walking slower. The path softens underfoot, gravel giving way to moss, stone turning to earth. The air is cooler here, still, like the world has paused just long enough for you to breathe without thinking. You carry no burden, no name to remember, no candle to hold, only echoes. A humming from the infirmary, the rustle of linen, the hush of a prayer never finished. You remember the herbs by the window, the dolls hidden under beds, the bundle at the abbess's desk, each one a piece of something too delicate for history books, too quiet for sermons, and yet it lingers, a secret wrapped in wool passed hand to hand in the dark. You step into sleep now, gently, without fanfare, without judgment. Just the slow, easy drift of forgetting where one story ends and another begins. The nuns are still there, somewhere, tending gardens, heating water, whispering truths into the folds of their habits. They're not waiting for forgiveness. They already gave it to each other, long ago. You're safe here, among the forgotten, the forgiven, the folded under. So close your eyes wherever you are. Let the walls blur. Let the stories settle like dust on the chapel floor. No more voices, no more candles, just stillness. Picture this. It's your wedding night in a drafty stone chamber that smells faintly of garlic, beeswax, and very old wool. A dozen people are in the next room, drinking your wine and placing bets on whether the bedsheets will be red by morning. Welcome to your romantic life in the Middle Ages. Before we slide any deeper into this evening of bizarre rituals and embroidered expectations, quick pause. If you enjoy these sleepy stories, a like and sub go a long way, but only if you really mean it. Also, drop your location and the local time in the comments, especially if you're listening in bed. Now, tuck in. This is boring history for sleep, the kind of stories to fall asleep to that make your eyelids heavy in all the best ways. Bedtime stories to fall asleep for adults rarely start with blood-stained linens. But here we are. You see, in many corners of medieval Europe, marriage wasn't official until it was consummated, and consummation needed proof. Not just satisfied glances or a walk of shame. No, what you needed was blood, preferably on a pristine white sheet, held up by your mother-in-law to a crowd of clapping witnesses at dawn. And if you were already familiar with the mechanics of intimacy, well, that created a problem. Enter the cottage industry of wedding night theatrics. One of the most popular tricks involved fresh animal blood. Chicken was used in poorer households, lamb for those with a touch more silver. The trick was simple. Before the ceremony, a discreet family member, or in some cases a paid servant, would sneak the blood into the bedchamber. Timing was everything. Once the groom fell asleep or stumbled off to brag to his cousins, the bride or her accomplice would carefully smear the linen with just enough crimson to look convincing. Now let's slow things down a little and imagine the details. The room is lit by one smoky tallow candle. The bed creaks like it's narrating every move. Your feet are still cold from standing in the chapel. Somewhere outside, a rooster is very confused about the time of night. And there you are, tiptoeing across the rush-covered floor with a scrap of stained cloth in your hand, trying not to smudge it all over yourself or drip on the dog sleeping in the corner. This, my friend, is a sleep story unlike any other. And if you're wondering, wasn't anyone suspicious? Well, yes and no. Everyone knew these tricks existed, but much like modern white lies, like saying you floss twice a day or that you actually read the terms and conditions, people preferred not to press too hard. A bloody bedsheet was less about truth and more about peacekeeping. As long as something red appeared by morning, reputations were safe. Dowries were protected. Pride remained intact. Of course, not everyone relied on blood. Some brides scratched themselves with a pin or bit their inner lip just before entering the room. Others brought in beet juice, though this had a tendency to look a little too purple under candlelight. And if you were desperate, you could always nick the groom's arm with a small blade in the dark and let him assume it was you. Romantic, right? There's even a recorded case from a small town near Avignon where a bride, knowing the sheets would be inspected, staged an entire fake fainting episode before the act even began. She collapsed on the bed, declared herself too overcome by virtue to proceed, and, according to local law, snuck out while her cousin applied blood from a duck's liver to the bedding. By the time she returned, breathless and dramatic, her husband was asleep, and the evidence was waiting. But here's where it gets even stranger. In some regions, the bloody sheet was stored as legal proof of the marriage. like a warranty card, but much weirder. If a man later tried to annul the union, the bride's family could present the sheet in court. There were even cases where sheets were washed, ironed, and shown to future suitors of the woman's sisters as a kind of testimonial. Because nothing says she comes from good stock like a piece of ancient crusty linen. Now, not all communities took this seriously. In certain parts of Italy and southern France, there were more relaxed views on premarital intimacy as long as it ended in a respectable marriage. But in other areas, especially among the nobility, it wasn't just a custom, it was a political performance. Failure to bleed could mean annulment, scandal, or in rare cases, imprisonment. One poor girl in 12th century Bavaria was sent back to her father's house with a note pinned to her cloak that simply read, "Unbroken." She later became a nun, possibly a very sarcastic one. And yet, through all of this, the real mystery is how little we actually know about what most medieval women thought of these rituals. Diaries and personal letters were rare, especially for lower-class brides. Most of what survives was written by men, clergymen, lawyers, physicians, none of whom had first-hand experience of wedding night nerves. We're left piecing together scraps and stories, many of them told generations after the fact. But the lamb's blood, that part shows up again and again, across cultures and centuries. It's the common thread in a patchwork of performances, a detail too weird to make up and too persistent to ignore. So as you drift off tonight, imagine that moment. You're lying in a bed that smells faintly of straw and rosemary. Somewhere outside, a dog barks once, then falls silent. And in your hands, you hold a sheet that will determine your fate by morning. No pressure. Bedtime stories to fall asleep for adults rarely include poultry products and legal contracts, but tonight we've broken that rule nicely. Now that you've successfully bled for your in-laws, real or otherwise, let's move on to what happened when blood alone wasn't enough. Maybe the groom wasn't satisfied with just a blotch on some linen. Maybe the bed squeaked too little. Or maybe, as was often the case, the bride had to worry about what her own body might reveal. After all, medieval folks had a lot of opinions about the female body, most of them loud, wrong, and surprisingly imaginative. This is where things get sticky, literally. Welcome to the shadowy world of medieval bridal props, tools, herbs, and creative insertables designed not to prevent sex, but to simulate innocence. Because, as you'll find out soon enough, faking virginity was less about hiding the past and more about putting on a show. One of the oldest tricks involved sponges soaked in vinegar. Inserted shortly before the deed, they would tighten things just enough to trick a nervous groom. Vinegar, they believed, had a kind of magical drying effect. In truth, it probably just stung like hell. But who's asking? More elaborate versions of this included small balls of wool, soaked in a mixture of myrrh and alum. The alum acted like astringent. It tightened the area, made everything feel more new. It also caused inflammation, which, in the warped medical logic of the time, meant it must be working. If it hurt, it must be good. A very medieval idea. And then there were leeches. Yes, actual leeches. Some women were advised to let a leech bite them just inside the inner thigh, about an hour before the wedding night. This would create just enough bleeding to trick a partner who insisted on proof. The downside, you had to be very careful where you placed the leech. Too far and it wouldn't bleed. Too close and, well, you'd have bigger problems than your reputation. Still awake? Let's add another delightful item to this toolkit: crushed snail shells. Some early midwives believed that mixing ground shells with egg white created a substance that mimicked the natural signs of virginity. Rub it on just before things got started and pray the lighting stayed dim. Bonus, if your partner was particularly clueless, he might assume the gritty texture was in fact proof of virtue, or just not mention it. What's important to understand here is that none of this was hidden knowledge. These weren't dark secrets whispered in alleyways. They were shared openly among women, mothers, sisters, neighbors, like a passed-down recipe, only instead of bread, it was social survival. Imagine being in a smoky kitchen 2 nights before your wedding. Your aunt, the one with 7 children and a suspiciously loud laugh, pulls you aside. She tells you, in detail, how to roll a piece of cloth soaked in sheep's milk and insert it just so. Then she pats your cheek, pours you a thimble of cherry brandy, and tells you not to worry. He won't know the difference. It's a sleep story with unusual ingredients. And the stakes, enormous. Because if a man doubted your purity, he could annul the marriage. You could lose your dowry, your family's standing, and your future. In some regions, even your safety. There are court records from Poland and parts of the Holy Roman Empire where brides were taken to physicians after the wedding night for examination. These men would then issue statements, actual certificates of virginity or lack thereof, based on their wholly unscientific, deeply flawed inspection methods. One popular test was the 2-finger rule. A girl deemed loose was judged accordingly, regardless of whether she'd ever touched another human being. This grotesque pseudoscience persisted well into the Renaissance, and, sadly, variations of it are still whispered about in some corners of the world. But let's shift the mood a little, because even in the dark corridors of these customs, you'll find humor. There's a story from 14th century Flanders about a bride who forgot to remove the sponge she'd inserted before the wedding night. Her husband, terrified he'd broken her internally, called for a priest, then a doctor, then a blacksmith, because apparently, when you're scared, you call whoever's nearby. The midwife, who eventually retrieved the item, reportedly charged triple her usual fee, then used the sponge to scrub her own floor. And to say what's worse, bleeding for validation or having your sponge repurposed as a mop. Still, what fascinates scholars isn't just the existence of these tools, but how widespread and normalized they were. Some were recorded in medical manuals, others in folk songs. A few were even carved onto the walls of bathhouses. In Constantinople, you could buy them in the market next to saffron and olive oil. Which brings us to an important scholarly debate. Did men actually believe these performances? Some historians say yes, that most husbands, especially young ones, had no clue what to expect and accepted any sign, blood, tightness, dramatic sobbing, as confirmation. Others argue it was a polite farce, a dance where everyone knew their steps. The bride faked her part, the groom bragged to his friends, and no one asked too many questions. And then there's the third theory, that the entire spectacle wasn't for the husband at all. It was for the mother-in-law. The real audience standing outside the chamber door with a clean cloth in one hand and judgment in the other. So as you settle further into this boring history for sleep, just imagine yourself as one of these young brides, your stomach full of nerves and your undergarments stuffed with vinegar-soaked wool. Outside, the night air is thick with the smell of peat smoke and roasted onions. Someone is singing, off-key, about love and fortune, and inside, your performance is about to begin. Bedtime stories to fall asleep for adults don't always involve leeches and snails. But when they do, you sleep with gratitude for modern plumbing and 0 witnesses. You wouldn't expect the local priest to be part of your bedroom problems, but in the medieval world, he might just be standing outside your door on your wedding night, sometimes with a blessing, sometimes with a bucket. It's a strange image, isn't it? You, nervous and half undressed, whispering to a man who last week gave a sermon on chastity. But in some parts of Europe, particularly in villages where the church held tight reins over daily life, the clergy were intimately involved in all things marital, very intimately. This section of our sleep story dips into one of the more awkward aspects of bedtime stories to fall asleep for adults. And yes, we're still talking about how medieval wives faked virginity, but this time they weren't doing it alone. Let's set the scene again. You're in a small village in northern Spain. The entire town has turned up for the wedding, and the priest has personally walked the couple to their new home, blessing the doorway, the bedposts, and the pillowcases. He even tosses a few sprigs of rosemary on the sheets for good luck. Then, instead of leaving like a sensible man, he stations himself outside the room, supposedly to pray. In reality, he's listening and waiting. Some records suggest that in certain rural areas, it was common for the priest or a trusted elder to confirm the consummation. They weren't watching, thank heavens, but they would inspect the sheets. And if there wasn't enough proof, they'd make suggestions. One such suggestion, hilariously recorded in a 13th century Czech manuscript, involved warming a wine bottle over the fire and placing it near the bride's legs to simulate post-coital heat. Science? No. Commitment? Absolutely. Now here's the bizarre twist. There are scattered accounts, mostly from Eastern Europe and the Balkans, where priests were known to supply virginity kits. These included red dye, scraps of goat bladder, and instructions for use. They claimed it was all part of helping young couples begin their union with peace. Whether peace meant deception or divine protection is up for debate. You're not dreaming. This is still real boring history for sleep. In one particularly strange case from Hungary, a priest named Father Andor was so committed to keeping village marriages intact that he reportedly kept a secret stash of pig's blood behind the altar. Brides could visit in private, receive a small flask wrapped in cloth, and promise never to speak of it again. Some called him Father Fix-It, others less kindly called him Father Fornicate. But this involvement wasn't always welcome. In wealthier families, especially among the minor nobility, priests were seen as spiritual advisors, not performance managers. The idea of them meddling with bedroom affairs was offensive, which only meant the poorer the couple, the more likely someone holy would be giving them tips on faking bodily functions. There's a famous account from an Irish abbey in the 14th century where a young bride, too frightened to attempt the blood trick herself, confessed everything to the local friar. Instead of condemning her, he allegedly gave her an herb paste made from crushed berries and nettles and told her to paint the evidence. He also suggested moaning 3 times and crying just once. Specific, but apparently effective. You might be wondering, why were these men so invested? Well, in small communities, every marriage was a public affair. If a union failed, it reflected on the whole village. And more than that, a scandal involving a non-virgin bride could create feuds, cancel alliances, or in extreme cases, ignite violence between families. So yes, the priest had a vested interest in seeing things go smoothly, even if that meant a few theatrical assists. The scholarly debate here gets especially juicy. Some argue that these clerics were simply pragmatic, trying to maintain peace and social order. Others think there was something darker at play, a kind of soft coercion where the bride had no real say. After all, if your priest hands you goat blood and says, "This is God's will," do you really have the option to decline? Still, not all religious figures played along. Certain reformist monks railed against these practices in their sermons, calling them lies wrapped in linen. They argued that if a woman couldn't prove her purity, the marriage should be reconsidered. Of course, these same monks often held deeply warped views on women's bodies, believing they were inherently sinful and leaky, so their advice didn't exactly come from a place of medical understanding. Let's not forget, this was also a time when people believed a woman's womb wandered through her body like a wayward ghost if she didn't marry early enough. So the bar for scientific credibility was low. There's one more story worth whispering about before your eyes get too heavy. In the town of Sandomierz, Poland, an elderly priest was said to perform wedding night rituals where he laid hands on the couple's bed and recited a prayer in Latin that roughly translated to, "Let this sheet bear witness." He'd then leave a red candle behind, just in case the bride needed help finding the right shade. Some say his candle was enchanted. Others say it was just berry wax. But either way, the message was clear. Lie if you must, but do it well. And maybe that's what lies at the heart of this whole tradition. Not purity, but performance. A blood-stained sheet wasn't just about anatomy. It was a symbol, a prop, a medieval Instagram filter. Something to say, we did things right, even if everything else had gone wrong. So next time you hear the phrase, the sanctity of marriage, picture a young bride clutching a goatskin pouch in one hand and a prayer card in the other, hoping the candlelight hides just enough. Stories to fall asleep to don't often include clergy-approved deception, but tonight you've earned that little twist of absurdity. Let it soften your breath and slow your thoughts, like warm wax on linen. You've got the lamb's blood, the leech bite, and maybe even a discreet priest rooting for your success. But let's be honest, no amount of vinegar or goat bladder will help if your performance doesn't sell the scene. And that's where medieval brides really had to step into character. Tonight's boring history for sleep continues with a crash course in the fine art of faking it, Middle Ages style. Because sometimes it wasn't the sheet that convinced the in-laws, but the sounds. Welcome to the world of theatrical moaning, bitten lips and mattresses that were deliberately loosened to squeak at the right moment. This wasn't just intimacy. It was live theatre. You lie there, palms sweating, breath shallow. Outside the door, your groom's brothers are listening. Somewhere down the hall, your mother-in-law is peeling fruit and waiting. The pressure isn't just emotional, it's societal. You don't just have to be a virgin, you have to sound like one. And so, brides learn to cry on cue, to wince at the right moment, to say things like, I don't know if I can do this, or I feel something tearing, even if they'd already had lovers, or were more scared of the splintery bed frame than the act itself. Some even rehearsed lines beforehand. No, really. A 14 to 72 household manual from Burgundy includes a section titled Conduct for a New Wife that advises practicing a fearful expression in the looking glass. Yes, a medieval mirror pep talk. Try not to picture it. Or do, it's a sleep story after all. And let's talk about that mattress. If you were lucky, it squeaked naturally, but if it didn't, someone might loosen the ropes beneath the straw so it creaked dramatically at the right time. Others place stones or bricks under the legs to exaggerate motion. Anything to create sound, a kind of medieval Foley effect to prove that, yes, something had happened in there. Still, nothing beat a well-timed scream. According to one London account from the early 15th century, a bride named Agnes screamed so convincingly that her new husband fainted. When he awoke, she whispered, "It was my first pain, I promise." They stayed married for 47 years, but not all performances went according to plan. There's a tale from Brittany of a girl who went a little too far with her dramatics. She howled so loudly that the neighbors thought she was being murdered. The town watch broke down the door and found her sobbing on the floor, surrounded by red-dyed breadcrumbs she'd tried to pass off as blood. Her groom, it was said, ran away and joined a monastery, probably for the quiet. Then there were the women who didn't need props at all. They simply relied on pure acting, slow breathing, strategic gasps, even fake trembling. They made eye contact with their husbands, whispered how afraid they were, and let the man fill in the rest. Sometimes the trick wasn't in what you did, but in how you let him feel. This might be the most human part of it all, because under the absurdity, the sheets, the leeches, the priest with his enchanted candle, what you really see is a centuries-old story of performance under pressure, of women trying to survive by playing a role, and not just survive the night, but the life that followed. Because a dishonored woman could be abandoned, accused, or worse. Her marriage might fall apart before it began. So yes, she learned to cry, to wince, to flinch at the right moment. Some historians argue this was a kind of empowerment, that by controlling the story, even falsely, women created a sliver of power within a structure that gave them very little. Others see it as tragedy, a forced charade, repeated again and again. Both views hold weight. Like so many things in medieval life, truth and performance were hopelessly tangled. But there's one more wrinkle. In many households, the post-wedding proof didn't just involve the couple. It involved celebration. If the bride performed well enough, the sheet might be displayed at a small breakfast gathering with cider and sweet bread. The women of the family would inspect the cloth, whisper comments, and then nod with approval. In some towns, they even sang about it. There's a Flemish wedding song from the 14th century that includes the line, "Blood on the cloth, joy in the pot." I'll let you imagine what that means. There's also a lovely, slightly twisted tradition from parts of rural Denmark where the couple was gifted a piglet the next day, only if the bride had cried with dignity. The piglet, ironically, was named after the groom's father, medieval humor. It's a thing. But even in these awkward, uncomfortable customs, there's something weirdly poetic. These brides, barely adults in many cases, were carrying out elaborate rituals with the calm of someone baking bread. A little vinegar here, a pinch of fake blood there, maybe a rehearsed sob, and voila, respect, security, and hopefully a husband who didn't ask too many questions. And if he did, well, she could always feign trauma, or point to the priest, or, if she was especially clever, ask him what he did wrong, since she bled like she was supposed to. That line, actually, appears in a Sicilian court document from the year 1400 and something. A bride was accused of lying about her virginity, and she replied, "I did my part. Maybe he's the one who failed." And honestly, legendary. So as your mind softens and the candlelight of this sleep story flickers low, imagine yourself lying on that squeaky rope mattress. A distant flute plays in another room. Someone is snoring by the hearth. And next to you, a linen cloth, carefully stained, waits to be folded and carried off as a badge of honor. You've cried your tears, whispered your lines, and played your part with the precision of a cathedral clock. And now, finally, you can rest. Just when you thought the goatskin and crying lessons were enough, medieval science crashes the party. And not in a helpful way. If you've made it this far in our bedtime story to fall asleep for adults, you've earned a front row seat to one of the strangest chapters in the long, tired history of virginity, the part where men with quills, robes, and no practical knowledge of female anatomy started publishing opinions. And medieval Europe had a lot of those. To be clear, most of what passed for science in the Middle Ages was a swirling cocktail of Galenic theory, religious dogma, and outright guesses. But that didn't stop self-proclaimed physicians from creating entire diagnostic frameworks around a body part they had never actually studied. The hymen, for instance, was believed to be a solid membrane that had to burst like a wineskin under pressure. Yes, really. A pop, a tear, a tiny trumpet of confirmation. In reality, of course, the hymen isn't some pristine seal. It's a flexible tissue that varies wildly from person to person. But medieval scholars didn't know that. Or if they did, they weren't about to say it out loud, not when the public preferred certainty over nuance. So what did they do? They started writing manuals, treatises, medical scrolls explaining how to test for virginity, complete with diagrams that look more like weather maps than anatomy. One popular method, known as the wine test, involved pouring wine into a woman's navel. If she was a virgin, it was said, she'd feel it in her womb. Pause. Let that settle. You lie on a table. A physician pours wine into your belly button. You're supposed to shiver, maybe cry out, and then they decide whether you're pure enough to marry the baker's son. It's not a sleep story, it's medieval stand-up comedy. Then there was the color test. Virgin women were thought to have paler urine, cooler breath, and a high, clear voice. These signs were written in medical texts with complete sincerity. If your voice dropped below a certain pitch, suspicious. If your breath was warm, harlot. If you blushed too easily, that's just biology, but in the wrong room it could also be evidence. And it didn't stop there. In some communities, particularly around the Mediterranean, young girls were subject to hymen inspections by older women, sometimes midwives, sometimes nosy neighbors. The process was about as dignified as you'd expect. And worse still, the inspectors were relying on those same flawed texts. They'd look for a little crescent or a certain fold and make a call that could alter a girl's entire future. But here's the best, and by best I mean most horrifying part. There were physicians who claimed to be able to restore virginity. These early proto-surgeons would use needles, vinegar, and occasionally dried lizard powder to tighten the vaginal canal or simulate bleeding. The result was usually pain, infection, and exactly zero convincing performances. Still, people kept trying. One bizarre remedy from a German apothecary's notebook advised the use of frog skin, dried and powdered, then mixed with goose fat and applied liberally before the wedding night. If that sounds unsanitary, that's because it absolutely was. But when reputations were on the line, even frog fat could seem like a reasonable solution. And yes, scholars argue over whether anyone actually used these methods or if they were more like medieval urban legends. But the fact that they were written down, preserved and passed on tells you something. This wasn't a fringe concern. This was a cornerstone of social logic. The belief that a woman's entire worth, moral, familial, and even legal, could rest on a membrane they barely understood. It's one of the great tragic comedies of medical history. And let's not forget, the men writing these treatises often had no surgical experience, no anatomical studies, and no training beyond a few translations of ancient Greek theories. But that didn't stop them from drawing diagrams with little arrows and captions like, "Where the Virgin's flower sits." Yes, they called it a flower. In Latin, of course. Everything sounds fancier in Latin. You're probably wondering, did anyone challenge this? Were there voices of reason in this sea of ridiculous diagnoses? A few. Some Arabic medical texts, particularly those preserved in Moorish Spain, expressed skepticism about the hymen as a foolproof indicator. These scholars noted that physical activity, injury, or even age could affect the tissue. But their work was largely ignored in Christian Europe, where purity was tied less to biology and more to control. And if we're being honest, that's what most of this comes down to. Control, surveillance, the fantasy of certainty in a deeply uncertain world. But in the soft candlelight of our stories to fall asleep to, let's pull back from the absurdity for a moment. Imagine being a young woman in that world. You've passed your wedding night. The sheet has been inspected. The squeaks were convincing. Maybe you even used the goose fat paste. But weeks later, someone questions your past. Maybe you walked too confidently, or someone saw you smile at a merchant. Suddenly you're brought before a panel of elders, or worse, a physician, and told to submit to a test based on powdered frogs and navel wine. What can you do but laugh, or cry, or in most cases, quietly endure? So yes, this part of the story is messier, both literally and morally. It's full of junk science, bad guesses and dangerous advice. But it's also a testament to how far people would go. To pretend, to conform, to survive. And perhaps, in some strange way, to hope that they might reclaim control of their own story. So breathe deeply now. Let the flickering torches of the past grow dim. The scrolls are rolled, the frog powder is shelved, and the men with their drawings have wandered off to argue about moon phases. What remains is the stillness, the quiet, the gentle truth that even in the most absurd beliefs you'll find echoes of longing, fear, and the very human need to be seen and believed. Now, if you've stayed with me through bloodied linens, vinegar sponges, and wine in the navel diagnostics, then you've earned the final part of this boring history for sleep. And I promise, it's gentler. Because beneath all the anxiety and absurdity of faking virginity, there was something else, an underground network of women quietly taking care of each other. It didn't look like a secret society. No robes or handshakes, no scrolls buried under convent floors. It was far simpler than that. A glance over laundry lines, a whispered warning during bread kneading, a thumb dipped into a pot of dye and pressed into another girl's palm. And maybe that's what makes this part the most human, because long before the wedding feast, before the priest with his goatskin stash and the mother-in-law with her judgmental candle, there were women who understood the weight of expectation and how to carry it together. In medieval kitchens, female relatives would gather the week before a wedding to cook, clean, and strategize. The younger bride, often barely more than a girl, might not have asked the questions out loud, but her trembling hands and darting eyes said enough. And someone, an older sister, a midwife, a sharp-tongued aunt, would take her aside and explain everything. How to cry convincingly, what herbs to boil if pain lingered, how to stain the sheet with beetroot if no blood appeared, when to bite your hand for swelling, how to knot the bed ropes to make them squeak more, which pillow to scream into. It wasn't just advice, it was survival. And they didn't always agree on methods. One swore by duck's blood, another insisted beet juice was too obvious. Some favored silence and mystery, while others advised giggles and distraction. But across all the variations, there was an unspoken agreement. This was a ritual. One they'd all been through, one they knew wasn't really about the body at all. It was about expectation, performance, the terrifying knowledge that everyone was watching and judging a moment that should have belonged only to you, and so they helped. They passed down the tricks, the tools, the quiet rebellion hidden in crushed berries and false sobs. There's an account from Florence, written in the margins of a cookbook from the early 15th century. Scrawled next to a recipe for almond paste is a single line: add red wine to linen for the girl's proof. Warm before placing. No name, no context. Just a note passed along like a breadcrumb trail for the next generation. It gives you chills, doesn't it? And in places where these sisterhoods were strongest, the brides walked with a little more confidence, not because they believed the lie they'd crafted, but because they knew they weren't alone. They had backup, whispered stories, old stains and folded cloths tucked into cedar chests like talismans. Some of the methods were downright strange. In parts of rural Bulgaria, elder women taught brides to fake swelling by soaking their thighs in hot brine. In a fishing village in Wales, they advised putting crushed fish bones under the sheet to create the illusion of a difficult encounter. Because if the groom looked terrified in the morning, people assumed it had been authentic. And no one ever talked about it again. That was the rule. Once the performance was over and the cloth displayed, it was folded up, burned, or buried under the bed. The bride returned to normal life, and the whispers moved on to the next girl in line. But even now, centuries later, the evidence remains. In household books, in folk songs, in the quiet corners of village lore. The sisterhood wasn't organized, but it was powerful. A rebellion of care in a world that offered women very little choice. It's also what makes this sleep story feel less like a tragedy and more like a crooked smile in the dark. Because even in the face of absurd expectations, women found a way. They bent the truth without breaking themselves. They stitched lies into linens and freedom into their stories. They reminded each other again and again that purity was a performance. And if you had to act, you'd better act well. And sometimes, when no tricks worked and the groom knew or didn't care, the sisterhood still showed up. With warm broth, with sweet herbs, with a gentle nod that said, "You survived it." So as you slip deeper into stillness now, picture the last candle burning low in that stone cottage, the bride finally alone. Her stained sheet hanging just outside the window. A neighbor woman walking past, glancing up and smiling knowingly. No words, just understanding, because before science, before reason, before autonomy, there was solidarity, quiet, clever, soft as linen. And if that doesn't help you sleep tonight, I don't know what will. Wind down. You've made it to the end now. The torches have gone out, the guests have wandered home, and even the judgmental mother-in-law has fallen asleep in her chair by the fire. There's nothing left to perform. No linens to stain, no stories to invent, just stillness. Let your thoughts drift back through everything you've heard. The blood, the leeches, the wine-soaked belly buttons, all of it absurd, strange, human, and yet somehow familiar in its own odd way. Because under all those rituals and whispers was a simple, ancient truth. People have always done what they must to survive in the worlds they didn't create. So take a slow breath now. Feel the softness of your bed, the quiet in your room. No one's watching, no one's listening for proof. The stories have done their work. They've made you smile, shake your head, and maybe wonder at how history is never just dates and battles. Sometimes it's beet juice and feather mattresses. You're far from that world now, but pieces of it linger in the way we speak, the way we love, the way we try to be believed. Let those pieces float past you like smoke. Let them fade. You are safe here. The only performance left is the one your breathing makes, slow, gentle, steady, like waves on old stone, like wind brushing through linen on a line. This is the part of the story where nothing more needs to be said. No proof required, no stains on the sheet, just sleep. You find yourself in a candlelit stone scriptorium, the kind where the air tastes like old parchment and melted wax. A monk is hunched over a desk, his thin fingers stained with ink and maybe a little fear. He's scribbling faster than he should, muttering under his breath about a woman from the next village whose hair was the color of burning leaves. Red as sin, he calls it. He says her presence made the butter curdle and the sheep miscarry. You don't interrupt. You just stand there watching the ink dry. This is one of those boring history for sleep nights, full of dusty scrolls and wild superstition. The kind of sleepy story where people made up rules just to keep themselves from panicking. We're not solving anything tonight. We're just drifting. One odd story at a time. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And while you're at it, leave a comment with your location and what time it is right now where you are. It's oddly fun to see who's falling asleep together. Anyway, the monk, he writes in Latin, but the gist is clear. The woman with the red hair had done nothing wrong. She just walked into the market, bought onions, maybe smiled at the wrong man. By nightfall, half the village decided she had summoned a storm. It wasn't just her. In medieval Europe, red hair had a reputation, a bad one, not just because it stood out, which it definitely did in a sea of dusty browns and sun-faded blondes, but because people genuinely believed it had power. And not the fun kind of power either. We're talking curses, seductions, and spontaneous milk spoilage. You shuffle past shelves of ancient herbals and bestiaries, and they're full of it. Red-haired women associated with foxes, serpents, and fire. Even the saints seemed nervous around them. In one Irish tale, Saint Bridget was said to have prayed her beauty away to avoid unwanted attention. She was also, interestingly, said to be red-haired before the prayer worked. The fear wasn't based on science, of course. It was emotional, symbolic. Red hair wasn't just about looks. It hinted at something unruly, passionate, untamed, and nothing scared a medieval cleric more than a woman who didn't blush when men stared. There's a story tucked in the margins of a 14th century alchemical text, somewhere between the notes on lead and the virtues of rosemary. It tells of a duke's wife who dyed her hair black every Holy Week, not out of vanity, but because red was considered impure during Lent, like wearing sin on your scalp. That wasn't a one-off either. Some noble households went as far as banning red-haired wet nurses, believing their tempers would pass into the children through breast milk. There's even a manual from Germany that recommends bleeding the red-headed servant girl more often, because apparently they needed help taming their inner demons. You duck into a different chamber, this one packed with records from inquisitions. It's chilly, and the shelves smell like old vinegar. Here, red-headed women show up again and again in the worst kind of way. Witchcraft trials, heresy, allegations of poisoning or charming livestock, almost always paired with that little note, with hair the color of rust or flame tressed. One entry simply says, "She would not bend. Her eyes and hair were too bright." Now, were they actually being punished for their hair color? Not entirely, but the hair certainly didn't help. It was like arriving at court already wearing the color of guilt. Here's a weird twist. Some red-headed women were believed to be changelings, children swapped by fairies. The reasoning? Their coloring was too wild to be human. You weren't ugly, just otherworldly. Kind of like if your freckles matched a constellation, people assumed you were part owl. And it wasn't all local gossip. Kings, too, developed their own strange aversions. Chroniclers note that King Charles VI of France had a phobia of red-headed women. He believed they gave him prophetic dreams, nightmares really, always ending in fire. The red hair thing even made it into medicine. Medieval physicians tried to explain it through humors. No, not jokes, but the ancient belief that your body was governed by 4 liquids: blood, phlegm, black bile, and yellow bile. Redheads, they said, had too much yellow bile, making them prone to anger, lust, and unpredictable mood swings, which is just a long-winded way of saying, don't trust her, she's got opinions. Of course, science didn't agree, but science rarely got the upper hand in medieval bedrooms or courts. What mattered more was that someone, usually a man with a robe and an agenda, could point and say, "She has the devil in her curls." And yet, red hair persisted. It didn't vanish. Maybe because some secretly admired it. Maybe because the fear was tinged with fascination. Maybe both. You can picture a young squire staring too long at the red-headed daughter of the baker, then praying for forgiveness on his knees by morning, not because she did anything, but because he couldn't stop looking. Sleep story, they'd call this now. Stories to fall asleep to. But imagine trying to sleep in a time where hair color could land you in a dungeon, where superstition carried more weight than evidence, where monks wrote warnings, not prayers. One last tale before we glide into the next room. In Scotland, there's a legend of a ghost woman with red hair who haunts lochs and lures travelers with lullabies. They say her singing sounds like wind through dying leaves, and she only appears when the moon is full and the water is too still. If you see her reflection, it's already too late. So yes, red hair scared kings, but maybe not just because it was different, maybe because it reminded them they didn't understand everything. And in medieval times, what you didn't understand could destroy you. You leave the scriptorium behind, walking slowly through a drafty corridor lined with creaky wooden panels. The stone floor is uneven under your feet, worn smooth by generations of overly suspicious men in tights and tunics. You reach a door. It's carved with spirals and vines, as if someone tried to make it look welcoming, but failed. Inside, the air smells like smoke, rosemary, and damp wool. You step into a courtroom, but not the kind you'd want to be judged in. There's a girl on trial, barely past childhood. Her hands are bound, her eyes too wide. Her hair is a brilliant tangle of orange and copper, falling over her shoulders like wildfire. No one will meet her gaze. You take a seat on a splintered bench, just in time to see her accuser produce a duck. Yes, an actual duck. Because this is one of those bedtime stories to fall asleep for adults that makes you wonder if the whole Middle Ages was some elaborate fever dream. According to the judge, if she weighs less than the duck, she's probably not a witch. If she floats in the river, she's guilty. If she sinks, she's innocent, but of course, also dead. These were the standards. You shift on the bench, and a woman next to you whispers that red hair is the mark of Lilith. She makes a sign to ward off evil, then spits twice for good measure. And she's not alone in her thinking. You glance around. Everywhere, people are whispering, clutching rosaries, glaring at the girl like she's a loaded weapon just waiting to explode. To them, red hair wasn't just unusual. It was a scarlet banner of warning. The connection between witches and red hair wasn't an accident. In many regions, the Malleus Maleficarum, the infamous witch-hunting manual written by two slightly too enthusiastic monks, described witches as possessing fiery hair, unruly spirits, and a fondness for unnatural knowledge. Unnatural knowledge, of course, could mean anything from herbal medicine to the ability to read. You slide your gaze to the jury. They look half asleep, but not in the cozy stories to fall asleep to kind of way. More like they've heard this all before and are just waiting for the part where someone screams and the devil gets blamed. In Eastern Europe, the stories went deeper. People believed that red-haired girls could see ghosts, that if they stood in a graveyard at twilight, the spirits would whisper secrets only they could hear. Some were said to use that knowledge to cure illness. Others were burned alive for it. You might think this all sounds like the stuff of legend, but records from the 15th and 16th centuries are full of red-headed women accused of bewitching cows, spoiling grain, or seducing men into madness. And by seducing, we mean looking someone in the eye for too long. And there's more. In parts of Italy, especially the deeply rural parts where churches doubled as fortresses, red hair was thought to be inherited from the ancient Roman goddesses. Venus herself was sometimes depicted with auburn curls, meaning beauty and danger were bundled into the same myth. That didn't help women much. If anything, it just made them easier to blame. You walk through the courtroom now, stepping past a table full of evidence, a crooked spoon, a clump of herbs, a wooden comb. Beside it lies a faded drawing of the accused, her hair colored in with what looks like real pigment, carefully shaded to show every strand. It's strangely beautiful, and you pause. For a moment, you wonder if the artist admired her. Maybe they added too much red on purpose. Maybe this was someone's way of remembering her as more than just another trial. You pass through a narrow hallway, the kind that echoes with every footstep. On one wall, you find a tapestry half-hung, its threadbare surface showing a woman with red hair holding a candle. Around her, shadows twist into animals, cats, wolves, serpents. And in the corner, a group of monks watching her from behind a tree. You recognize the pattern. Fear disguised as righteousness. In folklore, red-headed witches were often blamed for everything from hailstorms to poor harvests, but they were also said to be immune to love spells, which really irritated people who trafficked in potions and charms. If a redhead couldn't be enchanted, she must have already belonged to the devil. You reach the back of the courtroom. A small door opens into a room where scribes copied confessions. Not written freely, of course. Most were inspired by torture, or at the very least, a good hard shove towards self-preservation. In one confession, a woman named Isolde admits to walking through a field of poppies and singing lullabies that made children sleep too deeply. Her hair, the scribe notes, was like rusted iron. It's worth remembering, most red-haired women weren't witches. Most witches weren't even witches. They were midwives, healers, outcasts, or simply unlucky. But once the association between red hair and sorcery took root, it spread like fire. The church didn't need proof, the villagers didn't ask questions, and the kings, well, they started to get nervous. That's when the fear traveled upward, from the fields to the throne room. You pause in the hallway again, looking back at the courtroom, the duck still waddling on the table like it owns the place. The girl is gone. Maybe she passed the test. Maybe she didn't. No one's talking about it now. What they are talking about is the Queen's new maid. She arrived last week, quiet, polite, helpful, and unmistakably red-headed. The court is already whispering. A nobleman found a lizard under his pillow. A servant swears his boots walked on their own, and no one's blaming the rat problem. No, they're all looking at the maid, wondering what she really wants, wondering if she dreams of crowns or curses. You smile softly, because deep down, you already know the answer. You're not sure how you got into the throne room. One moment, you were drifting past those whispering halls, and now here you are, in a chamber so extravagantly draped in velvet and gold it feels like stepping into someone's insecurity made visible. The king is pacing, not striding like a man in command, but pacing, uneven, restless, muttering in half Latin, half dread. You recognize the look. It's the same one worn by gamblers on a losing streak or noblemen who just found a red hair on their pillow and no red-haired lover in their bed. Something's bothering him, and that something, as usual, involves a woman. Specifically, a woman with red hair. See, you're now in the part of this sleep story where superstition climbs the social ladder, where stories to fall asleep to start including monarchs and power-hungry clergy, not just village healers and market wives. And the stakes? Much higher. Because when a king believes a prophecy, people die to make it stop coming true. A scroll lies open on the royal desk, its wax seal cracked in haste. The ink is still fresh. The words are cryptic, of course. Prophecies always are. Something about a crimson serpent and the fall of the lion's line. The king is staring at it like it just spat in his soup. Apparently this isn't the first time red hair has invaded his dreams. History, boring and sleepy as it can be, has plenty of these kings, men with too much power and not enough therapy. King Philip IV of France reportedly banned all red-haired courtesans from court after a string of bad omens. Meanwhile, an early Hungarian king, Andras II, is said to have executed a red-haired concubine because his astrologer warned him she would undermine the crown through her womb. Yes, her womb. That's how fragile thrones were back then. You wander deeper into the chamber where the court astrologer is whispering in the corner, reeking of cloves and nervous ambition. He swears he saw Mars in retrograde and a blood moon hanging above the northern woods. And guess what color the Queen's niece's hair is? Exactly. It's never just about the hair, it's about what it means. Red hair suggested seduction, rebellion, power without permission. To a king trying to keep his lineage clean and his people obedient, that was terrifying. You pause at the stained glass window. It's depicting St. Margaret defeating a dragon, but the dragon has auburn scales. Coincidence? Maybe. But to a king, that's practically a threat from God. Royal advisors were always on edge when it came to women, but red-haired ones got a special level of scrutiny. A 13th century document from Aragon actually warns against women with sun-kissed locks who speak with confidence. The implication being, if she knows what she wants and her hair doesn't fade with age, she must be plotting something. Kings didn't just fear being seduced, they feared being replaced. And what better symbol of that than a mysterious woman who walks in with wild hair and a smile like she knows the end of your story? There's a tale, one of those slippery ones with too many versions, about a northern queen who wore her hair loose during a council meeting. Apparently, the sight of her red curls cascading over her fur-lined cloak was enough to throw the entire court into chaos. Half the lords claimed she bewitched them, the other half proposed marriage. You sit in a velvet chair now, watching a scribe transcribe something the king just muttered. Something about banishing the flame-haired. The scribe doesn't flinch, just keeps writing. He's probably done this before. Back then, redheads were banned from inheritance in some royal courts. Not officially, of course, but quietly. A duke with a ginger daughter might find her suddenly married off to a distant cousin or sent to a convent for her own safety. The idea of red hair corrupting a bloodline was stronger than reason. Ironically, some kings had red hair themselves. Richard the Lionheart, for example, was famously ruddy. But that was different. When men had it, it was valor or the blood of war. When women had it, it was temptation or a mark of ungoverned fire. You walk along the royal gallery now, a long hallway of oil portraits. Most of the queens are pale and gold-haired, with eyes like diluted honey. But then you spot one. She's turned slightly, as if the painter couldn't get her to face forward. Her hair is unmistakably red, pulled back with pearls. Her name has been scratched off. You know what that means. It happens all the time in these bedtime stories to fall asleep for adults. Women who don't fit the mold get erased, repainted, or rewritten. They vanish from official records, only to pop up again in footnotes, diaries, and local legends, like a stain that can't be scrubbed out. One of those footnotes involves a French king and his mistress, a redhead named Aveline. She was never crowned, but she was loved, or feared, or both. After her sudden death, fever, poison, grief. No one knows. Every red-haired woman in court was sent away. The orchards were burned. Even the king's red hounds were slaughtered. It's said the scent of blood never quite left the rose garden. You turn one last time toward the king, who's now sitting with his head in his hands. The prophecy is still on the table. The fire is low. And outside, somewhere in the village, a woman with red hair is probably humming while she bakes bread, unaware that a crown just trembled at the thought of her. You slip through a side door, and now you're in the royal chambers. Not the flashy throne room, but the quieter, more dangerous place where real decisions get made. Tapestries hang heavy over the walls, muffling every sound, as if the room itself is trying to keep secrets. On the long table in front of you sits a list, not of taxes nor battle plans, but potential marriage alliances. Names, ages, dowries, and hair color. You see it noted beside each. Blonde, fair temperament. Ash brown, proven fertility. Red, warning. The ink on that last one is darker, almost as if the scribe pressed harder in disgust. You hear voices now. Advisors, well-fed, half-bored, but very nervous. They're arguing about the king's cousin, a noblewoman with a strong claim to land in the north, and unfortunately a mane of bright red curls. One man suggests marrying her to an elderly duke. Another recommends quiet removal. A third wonders aloud if shaving her head would help. You don't laugh. You're too used to this by now. This is the part of the sleep story where politics and paranoia mix like wine and arsenic. It's still one of those stories to fall asleep to, but the kind that tucks you in with the creeping thought that royal bloodlines were only as strong as their superstitions. A red-haired woman with land, charm, and ambition. That was considered a triple threat. Even if she had no interest in scheming, the mere possibility made her dangerous. What if she enchanted a noble? What if her children inherited her coloring and her influence? What if she dreamed of wearing a crown instead of quietly spinning flax? You glance at a nearby mirror, the old kind that distorts your face into something unrecognizable. Reflections in those days weren't trusted. They were believed to show your soul, not your skin. Red hair in the mirror, twice cursed. A priest steps into the room now, summoned for his counsel. He doesn't even pretend to be neutral. He speaks of the Old Testament, of harlots with painted lips and fiery hair who led kings astray. He claims redheads are prone to wrath, lust, and pride, the three evils most likely to topple dynasties. You can practically hear the echo of that one in every anxious heartbeat in the room. But even here, not everyone agrees. An elderly matron seated near the fire speaks up. She remembers the cousin as a girl, clever, kind, always reading. She had a red-haired mother too, who was banished to a convent after a lord fell in love with her and abandoned his vows. Not her fault, of course, but try telling that to men who think blushes are evidence of sin. The debate goes in circles. No one wants to say it outright, but they're weighing two choices: marry her off before she becomes a symbol, or remove her before she becomes a legend. And then someone mentions a rumor. A traveler from the Low Countries claims he saw the red-haired cousin walking barefoot through a storm, singing. Lightning struck a tree behind her, and she didn't flinch. That alone becomes evidence. You roll your eyes, but the council nods like they've just heard a confession. There's a long silence, broken only by the soft tap of rain on the stained glass windows. Finally, the decision is made. She'll be summoned, tested for loyalty, and if necessary, dealt with. You step back, heart slowing as the scene fades. These were the conversations that shaped kingdoms. Not grand declarations or epic battles, but quiet little meetings about women who smiled at the wrong moment, wore the wrong shade of red, or happened to be born inconvenient. Back in the hallway, you find a tapestry being removed. A young servant folds it carefully, but you catch a glimpse before it's gone. A woman riding a stag, her hair billowing behind her like smoke. No name, no story. Just a reminder that she once existed. In the archives below, there's a letter from a red-haired noblewoman who was never crowned. She writes of her isolation, the endless suspicion, the fear in her handmaid's eyes every time she let her hair down. "I am not dangerous," she wrote, "but I've learned to seem like I could be when I must." And that's really the heart of this bedtime story to fall asleep for adults. Not that red-haired women were powerful witches or seductive traitors, but that men believed they could be. And sometimes believing was enough to make it feel true. One last whisper before the section fades. A chronicler in a quiet corner of Bavaria once noted, "The only woman our king truly feared was his sister, for she bore the fire not just on her head, but behind her eyes." Her name, curiously, is missing from all official family trees. But you know better. You've seen the red thread. It's always there, tangled in scrolls, tucked behind curtains, woven into the very idea of danger. Now you find yourself in a tavern, the kind that leans just slightly to one side, as if time itself got tipsy and gave it a shove. The fire crackles with more noise than heat, the benches creak under every shift of weight, and the ale smells like someone tried to turn bread into revenge. But no one here is paying attention to that. All eyes are on the old man in the corner, propped up by cushions, tankard in one hand, a loop of string in the other. He's weaving something absent-mindedly, maybe a snare, maybe a story. And when he speaks, the room hushes like it's under a spell. "She had fox eyes," he says, "and hair that flamed brighter than the Beltane fires. I seen her once, crossing the moor barefoot, leaving no prints in the frost." You lean against a beam and listen. It's a sleep story, sure, one of those stories to fall asleep to. But this one's got teeth, the kind of tale that curls around you like smoke and makes you wonder if the floor just moved under your feet. These are not the tidy histories of scrolls and decrees. These are the slippery stories that crawl out of peat bogs and sing you to sleep with one eye open. In folklore across Europe, redheads were more than just suspicious. They were something older, stranger, harder to pin down. In Scottish ballads, they were said to speak the language of birds. In Slavic myths, a red-haired girl left alone in the forest would come back knowing secrets she couldn't explain. Foxes became their animal, not just for the color, but the character, cunning, beautiful, unpredictable. To be red-haired was to be quick-footed and clever, the kind of woman who wouldn't wait to be asked twice, which naturally terrified anyone hoping for obedience. You shift closer to the fire, listening as the old man's tale deepens. He's describing a village that once tried to burn a red-haired widow for stealing the moon, not metaphorically, literally. They believed she kept it in a jar, and when night came and the sky stayed dark, she just smiled and said, "I was lonely." Absurd, of course, but the fear, that part always rang true. In medieval bestiaries, those glorified picture books where monks got creative, There are creatures described with hair like flame and eyes like glass. Some were angels, others were demons. Guess which ones had breasts? You thumb through a mental catalogue of these fevered ideas. One says red hair means you were conceived during your mother's menstruation, which somehow made you impure. Another claims that Judas Iscariot had red hair, and therefore so must all traitors. Some even believed redheads couldn't be buried in consecrated ground without a special blessing. The common thread? Red meant wrong, red meant danger, red meant watch her closely. But there's another side to it too, because for every whisper of curses and foxes and fevered lust, there's a counter-whisper of something holy. In ancient Celtic tales, flame-haired goddesses represented fertility and wisdom. They weren't feared, they were revered. You think back to Brigid, the saint who may have once been a goddess. Her stories swirl with fire and healing and stubborn miracles. She turned water into beer, cows into givers of endless milk, and flames into beacons. She was red-haired too in some tellings. Though by the time the church was done sanitizing her, they made sure to tone it down. Still, the folklore never quite let go. You glance across the room now and spot a young woman sitting alone, her hood pulled low, but not quite low enough to hide the gleam of red hair beneath. No one sits near her. The barkeep won't meet her eyes. And the old man. He's clearly telling her story, even if he doesn't know it. He speaks of men losing themselves after looking too long into eyes like hers, of songs she hummed that made crops bloom or wither depending on her mood, of a fox that always followed her, silent, loyal, never blinking. It's nonsense. You know that. But it's nonsense that feels good. That fits into the cracks left by things too strange to explain. And that's what folklore does best. It wraps the uncomfortable in poetry. It takes red hair, something rare, something beautiful, and turns it into a symbol for everything people can't control. Passion, intelligence, mystery, defiance. You get up to leave the tavern now, but not before someone offers you a charm, a piece of knotted red thread meant to ward off enchantment. You pocket it out of habit, not belief, and step back into the night. The air outside is cool, touched by wood smoke and distant rain. You pass a carved post warning travelers of witches in the hills. Beneath the warning is a crude drawing, a woman with long hair and a fox curled around her shoulders. The fox stares out from the carving, its eyes oddly detailed for such rough wood, and for a moment you think it blinks. That's when you remember what the old man said just before his tale ended. You can always tell if the story's true, if it finds you again later. The castle is quiet now. Not silent, but the kind of quiet that hums with old secrets. You move through its upper halls slowly, your fingers trailing along the cool stone walls. Dust dances in the moonlight, and every so often, a tapestry rustles with a draft that doesn't seem to come from anywhere. You pass a row of portraits, all slightly too polished, too idealized. Kings in stiff collars, queens with identical smiles. But there's one spot on the wall where a frame hangs empty, its outline visible only through the cleaner stone behind it. A portrait that used to be there, removed but not forgotten. The name comes to you softly, like a memory you never had. Queen Eleanor, red hair like spun copper, said to be beautiful, brilliant and, as court legend went, cursed. She was the last red-haired queen this kingdom ever crowned. This part of the boring history for sleep tale has a dreamy heaviness to it, the kind of story that people tell only once the wine has run out and everyone's half asleep, unsure if they're remembering or imagining. But it's one of those stories to fall asleep, to that clings that drips down into your bones and makes you feel like you knew her. Eleanor wasn't feared at first. In fact, people loved her. Her coronation was met with cheers, songs, and stories about her sunset hair being a blessing. She was said to ride like a soldier, debate like a monk, and laugh like a tavern girl. She made people nervous, but in the fun way, until her son was born. The boy had red hair too. And that's when the nobles started whispering. Too much fire in one bloodline, they said. God doesn't mark whole families without reason. It wasn't long before accidents started happening. Advisors went missing. Crops failed. A bishop died during Mass, face frozen in shock. Each misfortune was folded neatly into the same tired explanation. The Queen's blood is unnatural. You enter her former bedchamber now. It's been untouched for years. The fireplace is cold, but the smell of lavender still lingers in the air, as if the past refuses to rot all the way through. A comb lies on the vanity, ivory, delicate, with a few stray strands of copper, still caught between its teeth. It's said that after the king died, mysteriously of course, Eleanor stopped appearing in public. She ruled from behind curtains, behind letters, behind rumors. People claimed she went mad. Others said she spoke to spirits through mirrors. A few whispered that her fox never left her side. The fox again, always the fox. The official record says she abdicated, that she left the throne to protect her son from the same fate that claimed his father. But the unofficial version? That's the one that lingers. The one that says she vanished into the forest with her child, vowing to return only when red hair could wear a crown without fear. You run your hand along her writing desk. One drawer doesn't open, not because it's locked, but because it's stuck. You jiggle it loose. Inside, a faded letter, stained and fragile. It's written to no one in particular, or maybe to everyone. They call my hair a fire I cannot control. But I've never burned anyone who didn't strike the match themselves. If they fear me, let them. I was not made to be soft. I was made to remind them that beauty is not permission, and difference is not a crime. You fold the letter back into the drawer and close it gently. In the village below, children still tell stories about a red-haired woman who visits the sick at night and leaves wildflowers on their windowsills. Some say she rides a silver horse. Others claim she travels by mist. But always, her presence is followed by calm dreams and mornings without pain. You return to the portrait gallery. The empty space on the wall is just as you left it. But this time, as the moonlight shifts, you think you see a flicker of color. Not a face, not a figure. Just the briefest flash of red, like a farewell wave from history itself. And maybe that's the thing. Maybe red-haired women were never cursed, never witches, never demons. Maybe they were just reminders, living, breathing reminders that fear often disguises itself as tradition, and power, when it looks unfamiliar, gets rewritten as danger. So if you ever see an old painting with the face scratched out, or hear a lullaby that ends with a fox crying in the dark, you'll know the story behind it. You were there, after all. You walked the halls. You listened to the whispers. You watched the last queen vanish, not with a scream, but with a smile. Wind down. And now, as the candlelight dims in the corners of your imagination, you can let the story settle like dust on an old velvet cloak. The footsteps fade from the castle halls, the last echoes of fear and fascination slipping into silence. You've wandered through hidden courts and storm-lit moors. You've watched kings flinch at prophecy and scribes twist facts into folklore. You've sat quietly beside the accused, listened to drunk poets spin curses into lullabies, and peeked into drawers that hadn't been opened in centuries. And somewhere in all of that, you might have noticed a thread, not red like danger, but warm like memory. A thread winding through the way people label what they don't understand, the way a color becomes a warning, the way a whisper becomes a law. But that's behind you now. You're back where you started, in that soft, sleepy space where nothing moves unless you want it to. The night presses gently against the window panes, cool and unhurried. Somewhere far away, a fox slips through the trees. Somewhere closer, your breath deepens. Whatever color your thoughts are now, bright, faded, or flickering like embers, they're safe here. You've earned the stillness. You've heard the stories. And none of them need to be sorted or solved. They can simply float. So take one more breath. Let it out slowly. Let the weight of time melt into your mattress. And if dreams come tonight with a touch of fire at the edges, don't worry. It's just a queen passing through, smiling in the dark. Picture this. You're stepping into a bathhouse at the edge of a medieval village. There's straw on the floor, steam rising in thick clouds, and the air smells like bread that's turned a little too excited about itself. Yeasty, warm, almost sweet. It isn't exactly inviting, but somehow it's familiar. It smells like beer, and not just because someone spilled a jug on the floor. This is one of those sleepy stories to fall asleep, to where you'll find yourself questioning what you thought you knew about history. Like, did medieval peasants really bathe in beer? Or is that just another one of those internet rumors that people love because it sounds both disgusting and cozy? Either way, it's perfect for this kind of boring history for sleep session. We're not solving world hunger tonight. We're following a trail of bubbles, hops, and hygiene routines that would make your dermatologist scream. So, before you get too comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And hey, tell me in the comments where you're watching from and what time it is right now. I love seeing all the sleepy corners of the world. Back to the bathhouse. You crouch to duck under the doorframe, low and wooden, soot-streaked from the outside fire, constantly stoking the bathing water. Inside, it's damp and dim, with flickering torchlight casting the kind of shadows that make everyone look older and wiser than they actually are. A stout woman sloshes a bucket against the stone, scrubbing the floor with a cloth that was probably white in a different century. In one corner, a boy sits in a half-barrel tub, legs hanging over the edge, shivering as an older man pours warm liquid over his back. It's amber-colored, slightly frothy, and steaming. The scent hits you again. That's definitely beer. Or almost beer. It's hard to say, because in medieval Europe, the lines between beverage, medicine, and bathwater were blurrier than your vision after 3 mugs of homebrew. Let's pause here for a second and clear something up. Medieval peasants weren't sloshing around in cold Heineken. What we're talking about is small beer, a weak, low-alcohol brew that people drank instead of water because actual water was terrifying. Contaminated rivers, animal waste, rotting fish floating downstream from someone else's village. No thank you. So small beer became the drink of choice. Even kids drank it, even monks, even nuns, although not all of them would admit it out loud. Now here's where it gets weird. If beer was safer to drink, why not wash in it too? The logic sort of checks out, by medieval standards anyway. If water gives you dysentery and beer doesn't, then pouring beer on your body might actually be cleaner than using water. That's not science, but it's good enough when you're covered in pig muck and working 16-hour days. And let's not forget, bathing wasn't always about being clean in the way we think of it today. Sometimes it was about warmth, or modesty, or superstition, or making the neighbors think you were less diseased than you really were. The concept of clean was more about odor and appearance than microbes. Now here's your first truly strange detail. In some regions, especially places like Flanders and parts of what's now Germany, peasants and even middle-class townsfolk were known to bathe in reused brewing water. Basically, they took the spent mash, the leftover grain and water mixture from brewing, and reused it. It was warm, full of plant matter, and sticky. You probably wouldn't come out feeling fresh, but you might come out feeling purified in some spiritual or communal sense. And if you were lucky, there might even be actual beer involved. A few taverns doubled as informal bathhouses, offering customers a hot soak in brewing byproducts, followed by a pint and some gossip. Picture it. You're submerged in lukewarm barley broth, while a guy next to you is arguing about local taxes and picking barley husks out of his beard. You might be wondering, wouldn't that be itchy? Yes, it would, but some people swore by it. They said it helped with joint pain, skin rashes, or evil spirits hiding under the armpits, and don't roll your eyes too hard. Remember, this was a world where doctors sometimes prescribed roasted mice for toothaches. Here's the scholarly debate. Were these beer baths actually common, or just occasional oddities? Some records suggest that certain brewers advertised their byproduct as having medicinal use. Others note monastic breweries giving away warm spent mash to the poor, who then did whatever they could with it, including bathing. But there's no consensus, just a mix of scattered notes, folk songs, and the occasional weirdly specific law prohibiting people from stealing brewers' waste. Now imagine you're there. The bathhouse is filling up with villagers, women in linen shifts chatting softly, men huddled in the far end avoiding eye contact, kids splashing each other and getting scolded. And somewhere in the steam, someone's whispering a theory that if you wash your feet in the same mash used by the abbey, you'll live longer, or grow better turnips. Because everything was somehow linked to luck, fertility, or health. And if none of that worked, at least you didn't have to walk home with river slime in your ears. So now that you're already soggy and smelling like a pub floor at closing time, let's slide into the logic that got us here in the first place. Beer wasn't just a beverage in medieval Europe. It was practically a life strategy, especially for peasants, especially when the water was trying to kill them. You see, most rivers and wells were shared by people, pigs, and everyone's waste. It didn't take a genius to notice that those who drank straight from the stream tended to cough more, lose weight, and then mysteriously vanish by next week. But beer, even the weak kind, had to be boiled during brewing. That heat killed off enough nasties to make it reliably safer. And the alcohol, though minimal in small beer, didn't hurt either. That's why small beer wasn't just a drink, it was breakfast, lunch, and dinner. You'd wake up, chug a mug, wash down your crust of rye with another, and maybe finish your day with a slightly stronger version that had a bit more bite to it. The idea of drinking water straight, unboiled, and untreated would have seemed about as sensible as licking a rat. But drinking it was just the beginning. Somewhere along the line, people started to believe that if beer was safe for your insides, it might also be good for your outsides. Enter the beer bath, not just as a random peasant ritual, but as a half-medical, half-mystical event. Let's say you're a blacksmith's apprentice. You've been inhaling soot for 8 hours, burned your thumb, and stepped in something the dog left behind. By the time you get home, the idea of dunking your body in warm, beery water doesn't sound so bad. And if you're lucky, the brewer next door just finished a batch and has some spent mash he'll give away for a song or half a carrot. Now it's worth noting, not everyone believed in beer's cleansing powers. Some clerics saw it as a distraction from more proper methods of purification, like prayer or a dry sermon. But in rural areas, practical results mattered more than theological opinions. If your neighbor bathed in hops and didn't get boils that winter, you were going to try it too. Here's your weird fact for this section. In some households, it became common to reuse the same small beer for multiple purposes. First, it was drunk. Then, any leftovers were warmed up for washing. Then, even those leftovers were poured into the pig trough. A full cycle of use, efficiency that'd make a modern eco-blogger proud. Even more curiously, some medieval texts, particularly in German-speaking areas, mention beer as a component in poultices for wounds. So it wasn't just for casual bath time. People used it to clean gashes, soothe irritated skin, or ease swelling. One folk remedy suggests steeping bread in beer and applying it to the chest during a cold. Not exactly FDA approved, but it probably beat doing nothing. Now for the scholarly mystery of this section. There's an ongoing debate about the extent to which beer bathing was ever a widespread practice, or whether it's more legend than fact. We have scattered references, a few illustrations, and some very smug tavern names in modern tourist towns that lean into the myth. But hard evidence? It's slippery, like trying to grab wet barley with greasy fingers. Still, absence of proof doesn't mean proof of absence. After all, peasants didn't keep diaries, they didn't write essays. Most of their lives are traced through what others said about them, which is a bit like trying to understand your own personality through Yelp reviews written by your co-workers. And yet, if you listen closely to the rhythm of the past, the whispers from old village corners, the complaints of monks about unchaste bathing habits, the silence in the records where peasant rituals go unmentioned, you get a feeling, a picture. Not of drunken beer orgies in barrels, but of something more mundane, more believable. A tired woman heating a pot of leftover brew, her son sneezing in the corner. A cloth dipped in the warmth and pressed to his forehead. Maybe it helps, maybe it doesn't. But for a moment, there's comfort. And when comfort is rare, even half-useful rituals become sacred. And let's be honest, wouldn't you rather sit in warm beer than cold river water? Especially in January. Especially if the river contains at least 2 drowned goats and a mystery slime patch. It was about survival, yes, but also about small joys. If beer could be drunk, poured, scrubbed and blessed, it might as well be worshipped. In a quiet, peasant sort of way. Not with temples and incense, but with buckets, steam, and a sigh of relief after a long day. So the next time someone makes a joke about beer baths as a silly medieval myth, remember this. In a world where everything wanted to kill you, rats, rulers, rain, religion, a mug of something warm that didn't end in diarrhea was worth its weight in gold, or at least in dry socks. By now, your clothes are off, your dignity's been left outside with the goats, and you're standing in a wooden bucket that smells vaguely like sour bread. Welcome to the medieval beer bath, peasant edition. No rose petals, no flickering candles, just you, a wooden ladle, and a very curious chicken staring through the door. Let's not romanticize this too much. This wasn't spa day. You weren't soaking in golden ale while a lute player serenaded your calloused feet. You were probably ankle-deep in tepid liquid that had been reheated for the 3rd time that week. And the bucket you were sitting in might have been used earlier that morning to brine a ham. Still, you crouch down, knees folded to your chest, and a friend, maybe your sister, maybe your uncle, maybe the brewer's half-blind wife, pours a ladleful of warm, slightly fizzy beer over your head. It dribbles down your back, and for a brief moment, it doesn't feel terrible until it gets in your eyes. See, spent mash and small beer weren't exactly filtered. There were chunks, grains, flecks of yeast that clung to your scalp like nature's worst confetti. If you had a cut, it stung. If you had a rash, it itched more. And if you asked where this particular batch came from, someone would probably lie. The real beauty of the beer bath, though, wasn't the luxury. It was the ritual. This was often a group activity, believe it or not. Families bathed together. Not because it was cute, but because firewood was expensive, hot water took time, and modesty wasn't nearly as sacred as efficiency. And for special occasions, weddings, births, seasonal festivals, there were group baths, communal tubs, large enough to hold 4 or 5 adults, maybe a goat if no one was looking. Ale, sometimes donated by the local tavern, would be warmed with hot stones and mixed with herbs like sage or rosemary. The scent would mask the natural bouquet of peasant life, which included sheep, onions, and constant anxiety. Now for your fringe detail. In some rural parts of Bavaria and Bohemia, there's record of people adding egg yolks to beer baths, supposedly for softness of skin. More likely it was just something someone tried once and then bragged about. But the idea caught on in local tales. Imagine cracking 6 eggs into a bucket of warm barley brew while your cousin holds your towel. If you can picture that and still feel relaxed, you deserve a medal. Let's also talk about the tubs themselves. Most peasants didn't own a proper bath. That was luxury. They used washtubs, barrels, or even troughs if they were feeling bold. Anything that could hold water and wouldn't fall apart when hot liquid hit it. And the tubs weren't just for bathing. After you were done, the same vessel might be used for laundry, brewing, or salting meat. Which means you had to make peace with the fact that your entire hygiene experience was taking place in a bucket that yesterday held sausages. Now here's the scholarly oddity. While beer baths are referenced in folklore and anecdote, written records are frustratingly vague. There are merchant inventories listing brewers' washings sold for a few coins. There are notes from physicians prescribing beer compresses for muscle aches, and there's at least one medieval play that jokes about a man too poor to wash in beer, yet too proud to stink like water. But detailed daily records from actual peasants? Almost none. It's the historian's curse. We have tons of scrolls about king's foot ointments, but when it comes to regular folks and their barley-scented bath habits, we're left with whispers and guesses. Still, some stories persist. There's one tale, passed down in an Austrian village, about a man who refused to drink beer but insisted on bathing in it weekly. People said he believed it made his bones stronger and his dreams clearer. He died at 87, which, in medieval years, basically made him a wizard. Coincidence? Maybe. Or maybe the secret to health wasn't avoiding germs. It was marinating in malt. Of course, there were regrets. The beer wasn't always fresh. It turned quickly. Warmed too many times, it started to sour, and not in the hipster artisanal way. Think vinegar and socks, and if you were particularly unlucky, it could grow mold. Still, some peasants swore that the funkier the bath, the better the cure. And no one really knew how long you were supposed to soak. 10 minutes, an hour, until the dog stopped barking at you. You had to figure it out for yourself. Or just wait until the liquid cooled, the firewood ran out, or the eldest person in the room declared you done. But here's the odd comfort. Even with the grainy texture, questionable temperature, and occasional floating insect, people came out feeling cleaner. Maybe not by today's dermatological standards, but spiritually lighter. They smelled less like sweat and more like bread. And in a village that was always one step away from plague or famine, that was enough. You towel off, scratchy linen that's been used too many times, and wring out your hair. Someone hands you a mug of the very same beer you just soaked in. You sip it, it's terrible. But you're warm, sort of clean, and no longer alone. And that might have been the real point all along. You're drying off by the hearth now, wrapped in a rough wool blanket that smells like old hay and soapwort. Your skin's a little sticky, your hair's crusted in dried hops, and your dignity has quietly excused itself and gone to bed. But you're starting to feel curious. Was this beer bath just a folksy habit, or was there something more serious behind it? Let's dig into the strangeness. There's this fragment of an old nun's journal, anonymous of course, written in a German convent in the late 1200s. She talks about a sister who brewed holy washing liquid on feast days. It involved ale, rosemary, vinegar, and ash. The idea was to purify the body before high mass. The bathing wasn't just practical, it was penitential. You'd scrub away sins as well as sweat. We can't verify that every convent practiced this, but the detail lingers like the scent of boiled barley. It suggests that beer bathing had, at least sometimes, a religious dimension. That people weren't just washing, they were trying to prepare the body as a worthy vessel. And let's not forget, medieval people saw the body and soul as deeply connected. Cleanliness wasn't only about skin, it was about spirit. Filthy clothes might shame your neighbors, but filthy skin could offend God. So if beer, already considered a gift from divine fermentation, could cleanse your pores and your conscience, why not let it? Now here's where things get even murkier. There are local records, mostly from Bohemia and Austria, of bath attendants offering beer baths as part of a healing treatment. Not monks, not doctors, just traveling women who specialized in what they called warming cures. They'd show up with barrels of herbs, boiled grain water and small beer. And for a few coins, they'd set up a bath in your barn or courtyard. You'd sit, you'd soak, they'd chant something vaguely Latin, and you'd come out glowing, or at least no longer itching. Did it work? Probably not in any way we'd call scientific, but people believed it did. And in a world where belief was half the cure, that mattered. Still, this leads us to a core historical fork in the road. Were these beer baths medicine or performance? Some scholars argue that the bathing rituals had theatrical elements, a sort of look how well we care for our own display, particularly around harvest festivals or wedding weeks. The beer wasn't meant to heal, they say. It was meant to show prosperity. If you had enough ale to soak in it, you weren't starving, you were thriving. And that theory holds some foam. A few chronicles mention grooms being bathed in warm beer before weddings as a symbol of fertility and strength. No one really thought the beer improved your chances in bed, but they appreciated the gesture. Like pouring champagne on a car. The effect was mostly visual, but the symbolism stuck. Then again, peasants weren't big on empty shows. They didn't have the time. So if a ritual survived for generations, there's a good chance it did something. Even if that something was simply warmth, comfort, and 15 minutes of not working. Fringe detail of the night. A 14th century medical manuscript from Prague claims that beer mixed with goose fat and applied warm to the lower back could increase a man's vital power, which is an elegant way of saying, well, you get the idea. Whether or not this concoction was applied in or out of the bath is unclear, but imagine explaining that to your partner. No, I'm not drunk. I'm medically vital. Another oddity, beer was occasionally used in eye treatments. Yes, you read that right. Diluted ale, filtered through linen, was used as a rinse for eye irritation. This wasn't common. Most people preferred herbal infusions, but the fact that someone tried it at all tells you how deeply beer had soaked into daily life. It wasn't just a drink, it was a tool, a salve, a social glue, and when needed, a bath. There's something beautifully cyclical about it. You drank it when you were cold, you soaked in it when you were sore, you brewed it with family, you shared it at funerals, and once in a while, when the day was long and your back ached and you had 3 copper coins to spare, you let yourself believe that warm barley water could wash away more than just dirt. So, was it for health or for show? Probably both. You finish the last sip of your own mug now, lukewarm and earthy, the hearth crackles, someone nearby is humming. Outside the wind has picked up and you can hear the distant bark of a dog or maybe a fox. You're wrapped in your blanket, your skin still faintly sticky, but there's a pleasant buzz in your bones. Tomorrow you'll go back to work, but tonight you feel something close to royal. You wake early the next morning, the floor cold beneath your feet, and your blanket smelling faintly of beer-soaked linen. The warmth from last night's bath has faded, but there's something lingering. A softness in your joints, maybe. Or just the rare memory of having done something mildly indulgent. As you shuffle toward the hearth, still wearing your tunic from 2 days ago, a neighbor's already knocking on the door. She's holding a bundle of dried herbs and asking if you've got any leftover beer from last night's soak. Not to drink, to bless her chicken coop. You blink. She's dead serious. And here it is. The superstitions around beer bathing weren't limited to the body. They extended into the fields, the home, even the livestock. There was this old belief, more common in rural areas, that brewing materials, especially spent grain, held residual power. You bathed in it to heal your skin, but you also sprinkled it at doorways to keep away illness. You poured it at the roots of sickly plants. You rubbed mash on a cow's belly if her milk started tasting off. Of course, no one said they believed in magic, not out loud. But when enough people quietly follow the same strange habit, it becomes a tradition. And traditions in the medieval world carried their own weight. Now, a traveling monk once wrote, disapprovingly, naturally, that he found a village in France where people made infants' first baths from beer and nettles. He called it pagan, which back then was shorthand for anything I don't understand. But the locals said it kept colic away, and if you were a parent in a time before medicine, colic was basically a demon. Another scholar recorded something even stranger. During lean years, some families would brew a bathing beer instead of drinkable ale. It was cheaper, often sour, made only from the last dredges of malt. It wasn't meant to be enjoyed. It was meant to serve, applied to wounds, massaged into joints, or poured into a bath to keep the family blessed. The line between cleanliness, medicine, and magic had dissolved like foam on a too-warm mug. And it wasn't only peasants either. There are letters from minor nobility complaining that their bath attendants used too much beer and not enough rosewater, implying that even the elite occasionally indulged in a barley soak. The difference was in how it was framed. For nobles, beer was fortifying. For villagers, it was old-fashioned, and for monks, it was suspiciously close to sin. There was even debate within monasteries about the line between usefulness and indulgence. One Benedictine record warns against worldly soaking, advising that monks should avoid beer in baths unless prescribed by a physician, which of course meant that monks got beer baths whenever they convinced the right person to write the right note. Now here's your bizarre fringe fact. In the 1300s, a Czech herbal manuscript describes beer stone being scraped from brewery walls and sold as medicine. That's not a metaphor. Beer stone is a real substance, crusty calcium and protein deposits that build up during fermentation. People crushed it, mixed it with lard, and applied it to sores. Again, not dermatologically sound, but someone, somewhere, swore it worked. And again, belief goes a long way. Let's not forget, this was a time when salt was worth its weight in silver, when shoes were inherited, and when survival often depended on whether the weather cooperated for 6 straight months. People didn't have the luxury of dismissing what might help. They leaned into what brought comfort, even if it meant bathing in something more likely to make you burp than sparkle. You see a pattern now. Beer wasn't just a drink. It wasn't even just a bath. It was a kind of ritual fabric, woven through meals, medicine, blessings, and baths. People talked about beer the way we might talk about health food today. Oh, you don't drink the rye blend? No wonder your turnips are stunted. And so the superstitions grew. Some people believed beer softened the skin. Others thought it made your blood warmer in winter. A few believed it attracted fairies if spilled under the right tree. And in one wild regional legend from the lowlands of the Rhine, it was said that if a woman bathed in warm beer on Midsummer's Eve while whispering her husband's name, he'd remain faithful until next harvest. That one might have been invented by the same women who invented wine headaches, but still worth a try. So was it real? Did the beer baths actually do anything? Maybe, maybe not. But they gave people a sense of control in a world that was constantly spinning out of it. A tiny comfort in a life that was rarely kind. You might go to bed hungry, but at least you didn't smell like a latrine. You might lose a pig, but your skin would be earthy in a rustic way. And so you walk back toward the bathhouse, carrying a new bucket of spent ale and dried herbs. Not for you this time, but for your grandmother. Her joints hurt when the rain comes, and while you know the beer won't fix that, she believes it might help. So you'll warm the water, you'll crush the herbs, you'll pour gently. Because in this little pocket of time, superstition and kindness feel a lot like the same thing. The wind is sharper tonight, and the hearth burns a little longer than usual. You're older now, your hands ache in the cold, and someone's just come to tell you that old Mikhail is dying. You knew it was coming. He hasn't spoken much since the last frost, hasn't eaten more than a crust in days. But now the whole village knows, and tradition demands something. You bundle up and make your way across the muddy lane to his cottage. It leans like it's tired too, straw roof sagging under its own memory. Inside, it's quiet. One candle, one woman sobbing softly. Mikhail lies wrapped in a blanket, skin yellowed, lips cracked. He's breathing but barely, and on the small table beside him, next to the bread he hasn't touched, is a bucket of warm beer. The room smells like barley, mint, and the faintest trace of wet earth. They've done it properly, heated the beer slowly with sage and thyme, stirred it with an old wooden spoon that once belonged to his mother. This isn't for drinking. This is for the final wash. You've seen it before. The last bath, a ritual more spiritual than sanitary, the belief that beer, being blessed by labor and shared with kin, could ease someone's journey to whatever waited next. They don't say heaven, just the next place, wherever that is. The women roll back his sleeves. Gently, reverently, they begin to wash his arms, his chest, his brow. They pour the beer slowly, not to cleanse, but to anoint, to say goodbye in the only language they know, warmth, patience, and ale. It's not scientific, but there's something sacred in it, and Mikhail, whose body is frail and trembling, lets out the faintest smile. This is where the beer bath becomes something else entirely. It's not about superstition, or hygiene, or even tradition. It's about dignity, about offering someone a moment of comfort before the dark, about saying, you mattered, you were loved, you deserve something warm. And in this moment, you understand why beer became the liquid of choice for everything. It wasn't the alcohol, it wasn't the barley, it was the familiarity, the fact that everyone had touched it, brewed it, carried it. Beer was connection, to the earth, to the village, to each other. And as they wash Mikhail's face, his breath grows lighter, softer, until it simply stops. No drama, no thunder, just a final sigh. Someone covers him with the same linen used for his wedding night. Another woman takes the leftover beer and pours it outside, at the roots of a fruit tree. For blessing, for renewal, for something no one can quite explain. There are no tears, not yet, only silence, and in that silence, a deep peace. Later, when you walk home alone, you notice how quiet the village feels. The stars are sharp, the air smells of smoke and yeast, and though your heart is heavy, you carry something gentle with you. A knowledge that the beer bath, strange as it seemed, was never really about the liquid. It was about warmth, about giving someone a moment of care in a world that so rarely stopped to offer it. And so, yes, medieval peasants bathed in beer. Maybe not all of them, maybe not often, but when they did, it wasn't for decadence. It was for comfort, for ritual, for love. And when you finally slip into bed, your limbs tired, your mind quiet, you'll think of Mikhail, of the warm bucket, of the way a village used what little it had to make something holy. And you'll feel the faintest hope that when your time comes, someone might do the same for you. Wind down. The hearth is low now, just embers. Outside, the wind moves softly through thatched rooftops and empty fields, brushing past shuttered windows and sleeping animals. Somewhere, a dog sighs in its sleep. Somewhere else, someone is pouring a final cup of beer, not to drink, but to remember. And here you are, still and warm beneath your blanket. Your thoughts slower now, softer, not so much thinking as floating. All night we followed the trail of steam and barley from crowded bathhouses to quiet last rites. And it turns out the real answer to did medieval peasants really bathe in beer isn't yes or no. It's a story. A gentle, foamy thread winding through muddy villages, aching backs, cracked hands, and stubborn hope. Because beer wasn't just drink, it was care, it was ritual, it was the warmth you gave to someone else when there wasn't much else to give. And now you get to keep that little piece of history with you as you fall asleep. That strange, lovely thought that someone long ago climbed into a wooden tub, let out a long sigh and felt, just for a moment, like everything might be okay. So take one last breath, let it be slow and deep. Let it carry away the noise of your day. Let your body sink into stillness like old wooden barrels resting in cool cellars. You are safe now, you are warm, and the world can wait. End of script. Sweet dreams.